The room smelled like bourbon and old paper. 9 men sat around a table in the North Carolina State Capitol building, 3rd floor, windows open to let the July heat escape, but really just letting more humidity in. It was late, past 10 p.m. on a Tuesday in 1898, and these men were solving a problem. Not a moral problem. They'd already settled that question in their minds. A legal problem. A constitutional problem. A problem that required careful thought, legal expertise, and a willingness to build something that would last. The problem was this. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1870, said you couldn't deny someone the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And these 9 white men wanted to deny black people the right to vote. All of them. Permanently. Without technically violating that amendment. They needed it to be legal. Not just enforceable, but constitutional. Because if it wasn't constitutional, federal courts would overturn it. Federal troops might enforce it, and everything they were building would collapse. So, they were reverse engineering the Constitution, finding its loopholes, exploiting its gaps, building a system of disenfranchisement so clever, so technically legal, so constitutionally camouflaged that it would survive federal scrutiny. And they were going to succeed. Alfred Moore Waddell leaned back in his chair, cigar smoke curling above his head in the lamplight. He was 61 years old, former Confederate officer, lawyer, newspaper editor, a man who spoke about racial purity the way preachers speak about salvation. He'd led a white supremacist coup in Wilmington 4 months earlier, murdered at least 60 black citizens, overthrown a democratically elected biracial government, and installed himself as mayor. No one had been arrested. No federal troops had intervened. No one had stopped him. And that success had made him bold, made him ambitious, made him want to ensure that what happened in Wilmington could never be undone by something as inconvenient as black people voting. Literacy tests, he said, tapping ash into a crystal tray. But administered selectively, our people pass. Theirs don't. We control who administers the test. We write the questions. We decide what constitutes literacy. Charles Brantley Aycock nodded slowly. He was younger, 38, a lawyer, former U.S. attorney. He'd be governor in 2 years. He was considered a moderate, an education reformer, a progressive who believed in public schools and infrastructure. He also believed black people shouldn't vote, shouldn't hold office, shouldn't participate in democracy in any meaningful way. He could hold both beliefs simultaneously, without any sense of contradiction. That's what made him dangerous. He wasn't some backwoods, ignorant racist. He was educated, thoughtful, careful. He understood law, understood politics, understood how to build systems that would endure. Grandfather clauses, Aycock added, adjusting his spectacles. If your grandfather could vote in 1867, you're exempt from the literacy test. That exempts our people automatically. The colored folks' grandfathers were enslaved in 1867. Couldn't vote. Which means their grandsons can't vote now without passing a test we designed them to fail. Someone at the table, probably Furnifold McClendon Simmons, future U.S. Senator, raised a practical concern. The federal courts will eventually strike down a grandfather clause. It's too obviously racial in intent. Waddell smiled. Not a pleasant smile. The smile of a man who'd already thought 3 moves ahead. By the time federal courts strike it down, we'll have had 20 years of whites-only voting. We'll have rewritten every county law, elected every sheriff, appointed every judge, controlled every school board. The colored population will be so thoroughly locked out of political power that even if they technically regain the vote, they'll have no infrastructure, no organization, no economic base from which to use it effectively. And we'll have written new laws by then. Different mechanisms. Same result. He stubbed out his cigar. The key is making it constitutional, making it about literacy, property ownership, understanding of government, never explicitly about race. Let the effect be racial, but never the stated intent. That's how you build something that lasts. And that's exactly what they did. These weren't the stereotypical racists you imagine when you think about Jim Crow. They weren't illiterate farmers in hoods burning crosses. They were lawyers, judges, legislators, former prosecutors. They'd studied at universities, practiced constitutional law, served in government. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they did it in daylight, in state capitals, in legislative chambers, with full knowledge and approval of their constituents. They called it redemption. They called it restoring civilization. They called it saving the South from Negro domination. They never called it what it was: the greatest state-sponsored theft of voting rights in American history, designed and implemented by educated men who understood the Constitution well enough to subvert it. Benjamin Ryan Tillman was doing the same thing in South Carolina. He was more explicit about it. Less concerned with appearing moderate, he'd openly led paramilitary groups that murdered black voters during the 1876 election. Got away with it. Became governor in 1890. Then U.S. Senator. He stood on the floor of the United States Senate and bragged about disenfranchising black voters. Actually bragged. His words recorded in the congressional record for anyone to read. "We have done our level best. We have scratched our heads to find out how we could eliminate the last one of them. We stuffed ballot boxes. We shot them. We are not ashamed of it." He said this in the U.S. Senate in 1900 and faced no consequences, no censure, no removal, no federal prosecution, because by then the North had abandoned Reconstruction, had decided that keeping the South pacified was more important than protecting black voting rights, had looked the other way while men like Tillman built a police state. Tillman understood something crucial. Violence alone wouldn't maintain white supremacy long term. Violence was expensive, unpredictable, generated bad publicity. But law was permanent. Law had the weight of courts behind it. Law could be enforced by police, by sheriffs, by judges, all operating under color of legal authority. You didn't have to lynch someone if you could just arrest them legally. You didn't have to burn down a black business if you could just zone them out legally. You didn't have to intimidate voters if you could just disqualify them legally. So Tillman wrote the South Carolina Constitution of 1895, specifically to disenfranchise black voters. Added literacy tests, poll taxes, property requirements, understanding clauses. Made sure poor whites could still vote through various exemptions. The result? Black voter registration in South Carolina dropped from 90% to less than 10% within 5 years. And it was all legal, constitutional, upheld by courts. James Kimball Vardaman was doing it in Mississippi. He was even more theatrical about it. Called himself the Great White Chief. Wore white suits, white hats, traveled with a wagon pulled by white oxen. Made white supremacy his entire political identity. He was also brilliant, educated, well-read. He turned racism into an intellectual framework, complete with pseudoscientific theories, biblical justifications, constitutional arguments. He made bigotry sound sophisticated. That's what made him effective. He was elected governor of Mississippi in 1903 by openly campaigning on white supremacy. His speeches were masterpieces of racist demagoguery wrapped in legal language. He'd say things like, "The Negro is a lazy, lying, lustful animal, which no amount of training can transform into a thrifty, honest, decent citizen." Then, in the next breath, he'd cite legal precedent, constitutional amendments, Supreme Court decisions. He made hatred sound reasonable, made disenfranchisement sound like responsible governance. And it worked. Mississippi became the model, the template that other states copied. The Mississippi Plan of 1890 pioneered the techniques: literacy tests, understanding clauses, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all working together to create a system that appeared race neutral, but functioned with absolute racial precision. Carter Glass was doing it in Virginia. He was quieter about it, more genteel. He came from a respectable family, became a newspaper publisher, then a legislator, then a U.S. Senator, then Secretary of the Treasury under Woodrow Wilson. He was sophisticated, urbane, connected to Northern power structures. And he was just as committed to white supremacy as Tillman or Vardaman, just packaged it more carefully. He led Virginia's Constitutional Convention in 1902 with one explicit goal: eliminate the black vote. He said it plainly to the convention: This plan will eliminate the darky as a political factor in this state in less than 5 years, so that in no single county of the Commonwealth will there be the least concern felt for the complete supremacy of the white race in the affairs of government. Not a backroom deal, not a secret conspiracy. He said this openly in an official constitutional convention with newspaper reporters present, and then they did it, wrote it into Virginia's constitution, made it law, and the federal government did nothing. These men succeeded because they understood that you don't maintain oppression through chaos. You maintain it through order, through law, through institutions, through systems that appear legitimate, that have the weight of courts and police behind them, that citizens can point to and say, this is legal, this is proper, this is how things are supposed to work. By 1908, every southern state had rewritten its constitution or election laws. The methods varied slightly. Some emphasized poll taxes, others focused on literacy tests. Some used understanding clauses. Many combined all three, but the result was identical. Black voter registration collapsed. In Louisiana, 130,334 black men were registered to vote in 1896. By 1904, that number was 1,342, a 99% reduction. In Alabama, 181,000 black men were registered in 1900. By 1903, fewer than 3,000 remained on the rolls. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic disenfranchisement, carefully planned, legally executed, constitutionally defended. And the men who did it weren't monsters hiding in shadows. They were governors, senators, judges, lawyers, men who went to church on Sunday, loved their families, considered themselves patriots, and genuinely believed they were saving civilization by ensuring that black Americans would never participate in democracy. They built it to last, and it did. For 70 years, the system they designed in those state capitals, in those legislative chambers, at those constitutional conventions held. The laws they wrote stripped the vote from millions of black Americans. The courts they shaped upheld those laws. The police they empowered enforced those laws. The culture they created celebrated those laws. But voting was just the beginning, just the foundation, because once you've stripped political power, everything else becomes easier. If black people can't vote, they can't elect sheriffs who will protect them, can't elect judges who will rule fairly, can't elect legislators who will fund their schools, can't hold any public official accountable. They become subjects, not citizens. People that laws happen to, not people who make laws. And once that foundation was set, once political power was consolidated in white hands exclusively, the architects moved to the next phase: segregation. Total, absolute, legally mandated separation in every aspect of life. Because disenfranchisement made segregation possible. Without political power, black communities couldn't fight back legally, couldn't vote out the legislators who passed segregation laws, couldn't replace the judges who upheld those laws, couldn't do anything except watch as their world was carved up into separate and deliberately unequal pieces. That's what we're stepping into. The moment when the blueprint became reality. When the laws those men drafted were implemented across every southern state. When segregation went from practice to policy, from custom to law, from something that happened informally to something enshrined in state constitutions and enforced by armed police. They built a cage, a legal cage, with constitutional bars and judicial locks, and they built it carefully enough that it would take 70 years, thousands of lives, and a complete restructuring of federal law to tear it down. This is the story of that cage, how they built it, how people lived in it, how they fought against it, and how, eventually, it fell. But to understand how something falls, you need to understand how it was built. Need to know the architecture, the engineering, the careful planning that went into making oppression legal, sustainable, and seemingly permanent. So we're going back to those rooms where laws were written, back to those conventions where constitutions were rewritten, back to the moment when educated men in three-piece suits designed American apartheid and called it progress, Because this is the untold story. Not the violence, though there was plenty of that. Not the resistance, though that's coming. But the system itself, the blueprint, the careful, deliberate, legally sophisticated construction of a racial caste system that would define American life for 3 generations. They said they were saving civilization, protecting democracy, ensuring good government. They said black people were inferior, couldn't handle the responsibility of voting, would drag down society if given equal rights. They said all of this with complete sincerity, backed by pseudoscience, justified by cherry-picked religious texts, defended with legal arguments that sounded reasonable if you ignored the human cost. And they won. For 70 years, they won. Their laws stood. Their system functioned. Their vision of America, a vision where black Americans were subjects rather than citizens, where white supremacy was written into law rather than simply practiced, became reality. But they didn't win forever. That's important. That's why we're telling this story. Not because their victory was permanent, but because understanding how they built it helps us recognize when similar systems are being constructed, helps us see the architecture before the cage is complete, helps us know what to look for when educated people in positions of power start talking about protecting civilization, about maintaining order, about certain people not being ready for full rights. The architects of Jim Crow taught us something valuable, even if they didn't intend to. Oppression doesn't usually announce itself as oppression. It announces itself as law and order, as protection, as common sense, as the natural way things should be. The people who build it don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as saviors. And that's what makes them dangerous. This is their story. Not to honor them, not to excuse them, but to understand them. To see how ordinary evils get enacted by ordinary people who convince themselves they're doing something good. The room in Raleigh emptied eventually. Those 9 men went home to their families, slept in comfortable beds, woke up the next day and continued their work. And what they built would shape American life for the next 70 years. But first, we need to understand what came before, what they were reacting to, what made them so desperate to lock black Americans out of political power permanently. Because you can't understand Jim Crow without understanding Reconstruction. Can't understand the cage without understanding the brief moment of freedom that terrified white Southerners so badly they spent decades building walls to ensure it could never happen again. That's where we're going next. Back to Reconstruction. Back to the moment when black men voted, held office, built schools, accumulated property, and briefly participated in American democracy as equals. Back to the moment that white Southerners called Negro domination and vowed to destroy by any means necessary. Because everything that came after, every law those architects wrote, every system they built, was designed to ensure that black political power would never rise again. They looked at Reconstruction, saw black people participating in democracy, and built Jim Crow to make sure it never happened again. That's the blueprint. That's what they designed. And that's what we're about to explore. Robert Smalls was steering a Confederate warship out of Charleston Harbor in the middle of the night, May 1862. He was enslaved. He was also a skilled pilot who'd been forced to navigate these waters for the Confederacy. But tonight, he'd convinced the white officers to go ashore and sleep at their homes. And now he was sailing the CSS Planter straight toward Union ships with his family and 12 other enslaved people hidden below deck. He wore the captain's hat, gave the correct signals, passed Confederate checkpoints, and then, once out of range of Confederate guns, he lowered the rebel flag and raised a white bedsheet. He surrendered the ship to the Union, became a hero, and after the war, he became something that white Southerners would spend the next 70 years trying to make impossible. He became a congressman, served 5 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, voted on legislation, shaped policy, participated in democracy as an equal. This is what terrified the architects. This is what they were reacting to. Not some abstract theory about racial equality. Not some distant fear. but actual concrete examples of black men holding power, wielding authority, succeeding at governance. Because Reconstruction, for all its problems and shortcomings, proved something that white supremacist ideology needed to be false, that black people could participate in democracy competently. Between 1865 and 1877, across the South, black men did something revolutionary. They voted, not in small numbers, not symbolically, in massive numbers. They organized politically, held conventions, formed coalitions. They elected representatives. 16 black men served in Congress during Reconstruction. More than 600 served in state legislatures. They were sheriffs, judges, lieutenant governors. P.B.S. Pinchback briefly served as governor of Louisiana, the first black governor in American history. They weren't perfect. Some were corrupt. Some made bad decisions. Some were opportunists. But show me a white government in American history that wasn't full of corrupt officials and bad decisions. The point isn't that black officials were saints. The point is they were competent. They governed. They wrote legislation. They built infrastructure. They funded public schools, hospitals, universities. They did the actual work of democracy. And white Southerners watched this and felt their entire worldview crumbling. Because if black people could govern, could hold office, could participate in democracy successfully, then the entire justification for slavery collapsed retroactively. Then, white supremacy became obviously false. Then the hierarchy they'd built their identity on was revealed as arbitrary, as constructed, as maintained by force rather than any natural order. So they responded with violence. Massive, organized, systematic violence. The Ku Klux Klan wasn't some fringe group. It was a terrorist organization with thousands of members that functioned as the militant arm of the Democratic Party in the South. They murdered black officials, black voters, white Republicans. They burned schools, churches, homes. They whipped, they tortured, they castrated, they hanged. And they did it openly, with community support, with no expectation of prosecution. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the KKK's first Grand Wizard, was a Confederate general, a slave trader, and a mass murderer who massacred black Union soldiers at Fort Pillow. After the war, he led terrorist campaigns across the South. Was he arrested? No. He was celebrated. Monuments were built to him. His birthday was a holiday in Tennessee. That's how accepted this violence was. But here's what the white supremacists learned. Violence alone wasn't enough. It was effective short-term. It could terrorize communities, suppress votes, kill leaders. But it was also expensive, unpredictable, generated federal intervention. Union troops would occasionally investigate. Federal courts would occasionally prosecute. Northern newspapers would occasionally care. Violence was a tool, but it couldn't be the only tool. They needed the federal government to abandon black Americans. And in 1877, they got exactly that. The Compromise of 1877 was one of the great betrayals in American history. Rutherford Hayes wanted to be president. Southern Democrats wanted federal troops out of the South, so they made a deal. Hayes got the presidency. Southern Democrats got home rule, which meant federal troops withdrew, which meant black communities lost federal protection, which meant white supremacists could operate without interference. The North was tired of Reconstruction, tired of spending money, tired of caring about black rights. They wanted reconciliation with white Southerners more than they wanted justice for black Americans. So they abandoned them, withdrew protection, left black communities to face terrorist organizations with no federal intervention. And the violence escalated, but smarter now, more organized. Because the white supremacists understood something. They needed to take back political power legally, needed to control the legislatures, the courts, the governor's mansions. Because once they controlled those, they could write the violence into law, could make oppression legal, could build a system that didn't require constant terrorism because it would be enforced by police, by courts, by the state itself. That's what happened through the 1880s and 1890s. State by state, white supremacists took back power, sometimes through fraud, sometimes through violence, sometimes through both. They rewrote state constitutions, passed laws restricting black voting, cut funding to black schools, segregated public spaces, and the federal government did nothing. Watched it happen. Let it happen. Decided that maintaining peace with white Southerners was more important than protecting black rights. But there were still pockets of black political power. Still cities where black men voted in large numbers, held office, owned businesses, participated in civic life. And white supremacists looked at these places and saw threats, saw what they needed to destroy completely before they could build their new order. Wilmington, North Carolina was one of those places. In 1898, it was a thriving port city with a black majority. Black men held positions as aldermen, magistrates, police officers. Black businesses lined the streets. The city's newspaper, the Wilmington Daily Record, was owned and operated by Alexander Manly, a black man who was educated, articulate, and unafraid. He was also light-skinned enough that he could sometimes pass for white. His grandfather was a white governor of North Carolina who'd had children with an enslaved woman. So Manly existed in this complicated space, where his white ancestry gave him some protection, some education, some opportunities. But his black identity made him a target. In August 1898, Rebecca Latimer Felton, a white woman, gave a speech claiming that white women in the South were constantly threatened by black men. It was the standard white supremacist propaganda, the myth of the black rapist, the supposed threat to white womanhood, the justification for lynching that had been used thousands of times. Manly wrote an editorial response. He was careful, thoughtful, but he made one fatal mistake. He told the truth. He pointed out that many relationships between white women and black men were consensual, that white women sometimes chose black partners, that the myth of the black rapist was propaganda designed to justify violence. He was right, but being right didn't protect him. Being right made him more dangerous. White supremacists across North Carolina lost their minds. How dare a black man suggest that white women could desire black men? How dare he challenge the mythology? How dare he speak this truth publicly? Alfred Moore Waddell, the same man who'd be drafting disenfranchisement laws months later, saw opportunity. He'd been looking for an excuse. Manly had just given him one. Waddell organized. He held rallies. He recruited. He built what he called the Secret Nine, a committee of prominent white business leaders and politicians who planned a coup. Not metaphorically, an actual coup. They were going to overthrow Wilmington's democratically elected biracial government by force. November 10th, 1898. 2 days after the election, which white supremacists won through fraud and intimidation. But winning the election wasn't enough. They wanted to send a message, wanted to destroy black political power so completely that it could never rise again. Waddell led a mob of 2,000 armed white men through Wilmington. They went to Manly's newspaper office first, found it empty. Manly had fled days earlier, knew what was coming, so they burned it, burned the building to the ground. Then they went looking for black residents who held positions of authority. They found them, shot them, beat them, drove them out of town at gunpoint. They killed at least 60 black residents. The real number is probably much higher. They overthrew the mayor, the board of aldermen, installed their own government at gunpoint, and the federal government did nothing. President McKinley was informed. He didn't send troops, didn't intervene, didn't even issue a statement condemning it. They got away with it. Completely. Totally. No one was arrested. No federal prosecution. No troops deployed. The white supremacists had proven something crucial. You could overthrow a democratically elected government in the United States, murder dozens of black citizens, install yourself as dictator, and face no consequences as long as your victims were black. Alexander Manly fled to New Jersey, changed his name, lived in obscurity, never returned to the South. His newspaper, his home, his community, all destroyed because he told a truth that white supremacists couldn't tolerate. And white supremacists across the South looked at Wilmington and saw a blueprint. Violence worked. Coups worked. The federal government wouldn't intervene. The North didn't care. black political power could be destroyed, and no one would stop them. That's why those men sat in that room in Raleigh 2 months later. Wilmington proved that violence could take power, but they understood that violence couldn't hold power indefinitely. They needed law, needed to build a legal system that made black political power impossible, needed to ensure that what happened in Wilmington could be maintained forever without requiring constant coups and massacres. Because here's what they'd learned from Reconstruction. Black people were competent. Given the opportunity, they governed effectively. They built schools, infrastructure, institutions. They participated in democracy successfully, which meant that if they regained political power, they might actually succeed, might actually build something, might actually prove that white supremacy was a lie. And that was intolerable. That was the nightmare. Not black incompetence, black competence, black success, black achievement. Because if black people could succeed despite slavery, despite terrorism, despite every obstacle thrown at them, then white supremacy had no justification. Then, slavery had been evil without purpose. Then, the entire social order of the South was revealed as arbitrary cruelty rather than natural hierarchy. So they built the cage, built it carefully, systematically, legally, built it to last, built it to ensure that what happened during Reconstruction, that brief moment when black men voted and held office and participated in democracy, could never happen again. Robert Smalls, the man who stole that Confederate ship and became a congressman, lived until 1915. He watched Jim Crow being built, watched the rights he'd fought for being stripped away, watched the progress of Reconstruction being systematically destroyed. He'd served in Congress. He'd been a hero. He'd proved what black people could achieve. And it didn't matter. None of it mattered. Because white supremacists weren't convinced by achievement. They were threatened by it. That's what the architects were reacting to. Not black failure, black success. Not black incompetence, black competence. Not black inferiority. The fear that black people might actually be equal. That given opportunity, they might succeed. That the entire justification for white supremacy might collapse under the weight of evidence. So they made sure the evidence could never accumulate. Made sure black people would never again have the opportunity to prove their capability. Made sure that voting, holding office, participating in democracy would be impossible. They called it redemption. They called it restoring proper order. They called it saving civilization from Negro domination. Really, they were building a system to prevent black Americans from ever again demonstrating what they demonstrated during Reconstruction, that they were fully human, fully capable, and fully deserving of equal rights. That's the foundation. That's what came before. That's why they built Jim Crow so carefully, so systematically, so permanently. Because they'd seen what happened when black people had rights, and they decided it could never happen again. Now we're going to see how they built it, law by law, state by state, right by right being stripped away, until the cage was complete. James Z. George was the architect, former Confederate general, U.S. senator, legal scholar. He stood before the convention and said it plainly. We came here to exclude the Negro. Nothing short of this will answer. Not a backroom deal. Not a secret conspiracy. He said it in open session, with reporters present, and no one stopped him because no one wanted to stop him. The Mississippi Plan, as it became known, was elegant in its cruelty. It had multiple layers, multiple mechanisms, all working together to ensure that black men couldn't vote while poor white men could. First, the poll tax, $2 to register to vote. Had to be paid months before the election. Had to be paid every year, cumulatively. Miss 1 year, you owed back taxes before you could vote again. $2 doesn't sound like much, but in 1890, for a sharecropper making maybe $150 a year, $2 was food for a week. And white registrars made sure black citizens knew about the tax, while quietly letting white voters slide. Second, the literacy test. You had to be able to read a section of the state constitution and give a reasonable interpretation of it to the registrar's satisfaction. The registrar, always white, always appointed, always loyal to white supremacy, decided what reasonable meant. Black teachers with college degrees failed. Black ministers who'd been preaching for decades failed, because the registrar decided they failed. No appeal, no review, just the registrar's word. Third, the understanding clause. Even if you couldn't read, you could still vote if you could understand any section of the Constitution when it was read to you. Explain it sufficiently. To the registrar's satisfaction. This was the escape valve for illiterate white voters. The registrar would pick an easy section, accept any vague answer, and let them pass. But black applicants got complex passages, had their correct answers rejected, failed regardless of their understanding. Fourth, the grandfather clause. If your grandfather had been eligible to vote before 1870, you didn't need to pass any of these tests. You were automatically eligible. Black people's grandfathers had been enslaved before 1870, couldn't vote, which meant this clause exclusively exempted white voters. It was brilliant, if you were evil. It appeared race neutral, never mentioned black or white, just applied these reasonable standards that happened to work with surgical precision along racial lines. And it was constitutional, at least according to the Supreme Court at the time, because it didn't explicitly say, black people can't vote. The results were immediate and devastating. In 1890, 190,000 black Mississippians were eligible to vote. By 1892, fewer than 9,000 remained on the rolls. A 95% reduction in 2 years. And it was all legal. Every other southern state watched Mississippi and took notes. Louisiana went next, in 1898. They refined the system, added more tests, more requirements, more obstacles. They were more explicit about it. Judge Thomas J. Sims told Louisiana's Constitutional Convention, "We have not drafted the exact Constitution that we should have drafted had we not been restrained by the 15th Amendment." In other words, we'd ban black voting outright if we could, but since we can't, we're doing it through these mechanisms instead. The Louisiana literacy test was particularly sadistic. Applicants had to read, write, and interpret any clause in the Louisiana or U.S. Constitution. The registrar picked which clause. The registrar decided if the interpretation was acceptable. Some of the questions they asked black applicants: how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? How many drops of water in this glass? Spell emancipation backwards while reciting the alphabet. Interpret the phrase ex post facto laws in the context of the 14th Amendment. These weren't literacy tests. They were humiliation rituals designed to be impossible. And even if you somehow passed, the registrar could just say you failed. Your word against his. And his word was backed by law, by courts, by armed police. Louisiana's black voter registration dropped from 130,334 in 1896 to 1,342 by 1904, a 99% reduction. The remaining 1,342 were mostly in New Orleans, where federal oversight was slightly stronger and some black Creoles had enough economic power to resist. Alabama followed in 1901. Their constitutional convention didn't even pretend neutrality. The convention president, John B. Knox, opened the proceedings by saying, "And what is it that we want to do? Why, it is within the limits imposed by the federal constitution to establish white supremacy in this state." They added a twist, a good character requirement. To vote, you had to convince the registrar that you were of good moral character. The registrar, always white, always appointed, decided what good character meant. Had you ever been arrested, convicted of any crime, even minor ones? Disqualified. Had you ever been accused of a crime, even if never convicted? Might be disqualified. Were you respectful to white people? Did you know your place? These became voting qualifications. And here's the evil genius. Alabama had passed laws making dozens of minor offenses crimes that only black people were practically charged with. Vagrancy was a crime, meaning if you were unemployed, or the sheriff decided you looked unemployed, you could be arrested. Once arrested, you had a criminal record. Once you had a criminal record, you couldn't vote. They criminalized black life, then used those criminal records to strip voting rights. Sound familiar? We're still doing this. The 13th Amendment banned slavery, except as punishment for crime. Southern states never stopped reading that exception as a loophole. They just kept refining it. North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Texas, Florida, Arkansas, Tennessee, Oklahoma Territory, when it became a state in 1907. All of them. All adopted some version of this system between 1890 and 1910. The specific mechanisms varied slightly. Some emphasized poll taxes, others focused on literacy tests, some added property requirements. But the result was identical. Black voter registration collapsed. By 1910, across the entire South, black voter registration was below 5%. In some counties, 0 black voters remained on the rolls. 0. In counties that were 80% black, 0 black people could vote. And it was all legal, constitutional, upheld by courts. But voting was just the foundation. Once black people lost political power, couldn't elect sheriffs or judges or legislators, the architects moved to phase 2. Segregation of every aspect of life. The Jim Crow laws, as they became known, after a minstrel show character designed to mock black people, spread like a disease across the South. Every state, every county, every municipality passed laws mandating separation. Not just separation. Separation that was deliberately, explicitly designed to be unequal. Schools first. Because if you control education, you control the future. The laws required separate schools for black and white children. But the funding wasn't equal. Not close to equal. In South Carolina in 1915, the state spent an average of $23.76 per white student, $2.91 per black student, 8 times less. For students in the same state, paying the same taxes, theoretically receiving the same public education. The school buildings told the story. White schools were brick, with glass windows, indoor plumbing, libraries, laboratories. Black schools were wooden shacks, dirt floors, no windows, no bathrooms, no books less than 20 years old. White teachers were paid professional salaries. Black teachers made half that, sometimes less. White schools had buses. Black children walked, sometimes 5 or 10 miles each way. And this was legal. This was the separate but equal doctrine established by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Homer Plessy was 7/8 white. His great-great-great-grandparents included 1 black ancestor. That's it. He looked white, could pass for white. But Louisiana law said that any black ancestry, any at all, made you legally black. 1-drop rule. 1 drop of black blood, and you were black forever, legally, with all the restrictions that entailed. In 1892, Plessy bought a first-class ticket on the East Louisiana Railroad, sat in the whites-only car, told the conductor he was black because he was planning this as a test case. The conductor called the police. Plessy was arrested, jailed, charged with violating Louisiana's Separate Car Act. His lawyers argued that forcing him into the colored car violated the 14th Amendment. Equal protection. Can't treat citizens differently based on race. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, separate but equal is fine. Segregation doesn't violate the Constitution as long as the separate facilities are equal. Justice Henry Billings Brown wrote the majority opinion. He said, with complete seriousness, we consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the 2 races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. Read that again. The Supreme Court of the United States said that if black people felt inferior because of segregation, that was their choice, their interpretation, not an actual effect of being legally classified as second-class citizens, just a feeling they'd decided to have. Only one justice dissented, John Marshall Harlan. He wrote, "Our Constitution is colorblind, and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law." He was right, and he lost 7-1. His dissent meant nothing for 60 years. Plessy legitimized segregation nationwide. After 1896, Southern states went wild passing Jim Crow laws because the Supreme Court had given them permission. Railroads and streetcars, cars, separate sections, separate entrances, same tickets, same prices. But black passengers got the worst cars, the most crowded sections, the cars closest to the engine where the coal smoke was thickest. Public spaces, separate parks, separate libraries, separate water fountains, separate bathrooms. Cities spent money building duplicate facilities rather than let black and white citizens share. Birmingham had separate elevators. New Orleans had separate prostitution districts, legally codified by race. Mobile had separate phone booths. Mississippi made it illegal for white and black people to share a taxi. Hospitals, separate wards, if black patients were admitted at all. Most white hospitals just refused black patients entirely, even in emergencies. Black doctors, no matter their qualifications, couldn't practice at white hospitals, couldn't get admitting privileges, couldn't treat white patients. Black communities had to build their own hospitals, fund them themselves, staff them with black doctors and nurses who'd been trained at black medical schools because white medical schools wouldn't admit them. Even in death, segregation continued. Cemeteries were segregated by law. White and black bodies couldn't be buried in the same ground. The dead had to remain separated. Think about that. The fundamental racism was so deep that corpses had to be kept apart. The fear of mixing was so visceral that even death didn't end it. Prisons were supposed to be segregated, but they solved that problem differently. They just didn't keep black prisoners in prisons. They leased them. Convict leasing was slavery by a different name. After the Civil War, Southern states passed black codes, laws that essentially made being black and unemployed illegal. Vagrancy, loitering, joblessness, all crimes. Black men were arrested in massive numbers for these invented offenses, convicted by all white juries, sentenced to hard labor. But the states didn't want to pay to house prisoners, so they leased them to private companies. Coal mines, turpentine camps, lumber operations, railroad construction. Companies paid the state a fee per prisoner, usually $10 to $30 per month. The prisoners got nothing, worked 16-hour days, were beaten, starved, worked until they collapsed. The death rates were staggering. In Mississippi in 1887, 16% of leased convicts died within a year. In Alabama, 25 to 45% mortality annually in the worst camps. These weren't accidents. These were men worked to death, deliberately, because the companies had already paid for them and wanted maximum labor before they died. And if they died, the state just arrested more black men and leased them too. This wasn't some fringe practice. This funded state governments. Alabama's convict leasing brought in 10% of state revenue. It was official policy, legal, constitutional, and it continued until the 1930s in some states. And every single one of these laws, every restriction, every act of segregation was passed by legislators who'd been elected only by white voters because black voters had been purged from the rolls. That's why disenfranchisement came first. Once black people couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't participate in democracy, white legislators could pass anything, and they did. By 1910, the cage was complete. Black Americans in the South lived in a police state designed specifically to control them. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't testify against white defendants, couldn't send their children to decent schools, couldn't use public facilities on equal terms, couldn't live where they wanted, work where they wanted, move freely without papers, couldn't defend themselves against violence without being charged with crimes, couldn't accumulate wealth without it being stolen or destroyed. And all of it was legal. Written into state constitutions, upheld by courts, enforced by police who wore badges and swore oaths to uphold these laws. That's what the architects built. Not just racism, not just bigotry, but a legal system of oppression so comprehensive, so all-encompassing, so carefully designed that it functioned automatically. Didn't require constant violence, though violence was always available. Didn't require constant attention, though police were always watching. Just required Black Americans to live their entire lives navigating a system explicitly designed to deny them dignity, opportunity, and hope. They built it to last, and it did. These laws stayed on the books for 70 years, shaped 3 generations of American life, created wealth for white families, poverty for Black families, gaps that still exist today. But laws on paper don't mean anything unless people live under them, unless the abstraction becomes reality, unless the legal code becomes daily experience. So now we need to see what this actually looked like, what it felt like, what it meant to wake up every day in a cage built by legislators, upheld by courts, and enforced by men with badges and guns. Now we're stepping into daily life under Jim Crow, and it's going to be worse than you think. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams woke up at 5:30 a.m. in his home in Chicago. He was one of the most accomplished surgeons in America. He'd performed the first successful open-heart surgery in 1893, founded Provident Hospital, trained dozens of doctors. His hands had saved hundreds of lives. White lives, Black lives, he didn't distinguish. Medicine didn't have a color line in his operating room. But he was visiting family in Mississippi in the summer of 1920, and everything was different here. He got dressed carefully. Suit, tie, hat. You always dressed well in the South if you were Black. Always presented yourself as respectable, professional, dignified, because the more respectable you looked, the more it enraged some white people, but the more it protected you from casual violence. Usually, not always, but usually. He left the house at 6 a.m. to walk to his cousin's store across town. It was already hot. Mississippi in July felt like breathing through wet wool. He walked on the sidewalk because the street was muddy from last night's rain. A white woman approached from the opposite direction. She was maybe 20 years old, carrying groceries. He saw her 50 feet away, and he immediately calculated. If he stayed on the sidewalk, he'd have to pass close to her. If he passed close to her, he'd be violating an unwritten rule. Black men don't pass close to white women. Don't make eye contact. Don't exist in their proximity if you can help it. So Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, one of the most accomplished surgeons in America, stepped off the sidewalk into the mud, stood there, removed his hat, looked at the ground, waited for her to pass. She didn't acknowledge him. Why would she? He was furniture, an obstacle that had correctly removed itself from her path. She passed. He waited an extra beat to ensure sufficient distance. Then he stepped back onto the sidewalk. His shoes were covered in mud. He'd just humiliated himself voluntarily to avoid being humiliated violently. This was survival. This was Tuesday. He reached the corner where a water fountain stood. 2 fountains, actually, side by side. One said white only in bold letters. The other said colored. He was thirsty. It was already 85 degrees. He walked to the colored fountain. The water was warm. The fountain was broken, barely trickling. The white fountain worked fine. He could see that. Cold water, good pressure. 15 feet away. Might as well be 15 miles. He drank the warm water from the broken fountain and kept walking. This was the mundane horror. Not the lynchings, though those were constant threats. Not the beatings, though those happened regularly. But the daily, hourly, minute-by-minute calculations. The constant awareness of your Blackness. The unceasing navigation of rules, written and unwritten. The death by 1,000 humiliations. Sarah Thompson was shopping in downtown Atlanta that same morning. She was a school teacher, college educated, spoke 3 languages, made $300 a year teaching at the colored school, while white teachers with less education made $800. She'd saved money for months to buy a new dress for her sister's wedding. She walked into Davison's department store, the largest in Atlanta. She could shop there. Black people could spend money there. They just couldn't try anything on, couldn't return anything, couldn't use the bathrooms, couldn't sit at the lunch counter, couldn't use the main entrance, had to come in through the side door marked colored entrance. She found a dress she liked, blue cotton with white buttons, $3.50, a week's salary. But it was her sister's wedding, and she wanted to look nice. She held it up to herself, trying to judge the fit by looking in the mirror. "You can't do that." The white saleswoman's voice was sharp. "No trying on, no holding up to yourself. That's the rule." Sarah knew the rule. Everyone knew the rule. Black customers might contaminate the clothes, might make them unsellable to white customers. So you bought blind, guessed at sizes, hoped it fit, and if it didn't, you couldn't return it. "I'm just checking the length," Sarah said carefully, respectfully, always respectfully. I said, "Put it down." Sarah put it down. "Could I?" "You want it or not? I got other customers." Sarah looked at the dress, looked at the price tag, looked at the saleswoman's face, made a calculation. Buying this dress meant accepting disrespect, accepting being treated like a child, like a threat, like something dirty. But not buying it meant having nothing to wear to her sister's wedding, meant letting white people's hatred control her choices. She bought the dress, paid cash. The saleswoman didn't touch her hand when taking the money, put the dress in a bag without folding it properly, didn't say, "Thank you." Sarah took the bag and left through the colored entrance. Outside, she needed a bathroom. She'd been downtown for 3 hours, but there were no colored bathrooms. Not in the department stores, not in the restaurants, not in the public buildings. White establishments had bathrooms, but they were for whites only. There were a few colored businesses scattered around, but they were blocks away. So she held it, would hold it for another hour until she got home. This was normal. Black women learned to dehydrate themselves before going downtown, learned to avoid drinking water all morning, learned to plan their shopping around their bladders because the city had decided that black people's basic biological functions weren't worth accommodating. She walked past a movie theater. She could go to the movies, could see the same films white people saw. She just had to enter through the side alley, climb the back stairs to the colored balcony, sit in seats that were worse for the same price or sometimes more. And she had to go at specific times. Some theaters only allowed black patrons at afternoon showings. Evening showings were for whites only. She kept walking, past a park. Beautiful park. Trees, fountains, benches, playground. A sign at the entrance. White only. There were no colored parks in this neighborhood. The colored park was 2 miles away. Smaller, no fountains. Broken playground equipment. But black families weren't allowed in this one. Weren't allowed to let their children play here. Weren't allowed to sit under these trees they'd probably planted and certainly paid taxes to maintain. She saw a white woman, roughly her age, sitting on a bench, reading. Just sitting. Just existing in public space. Just being. Sarah couldn't do that. Sarah didn't have that option. Sarah's existence in public was conditional, restricted, constantly surveilled. She made it home, finally used the bathroom, changed out of her good clothes, and started teaching herself not to be angry about it, not to dwell on it, not to let it consume her, because this was every day. Every single day. And if you stayed angry about every humiliation, you'd lose your mind. You'd do something that would get you killed. So you learned to swallow it, learned to function, learned to survive with dignity in a system designed to strip dignity away. But the hardest part was the children. James Cooper was 8 years old. His father was explaining the rules. Again, for the 100th time. Because getting them wrong meant death, and children forgot, and the stakes were too high for forgetting. When you see a white person, what do? Step off the sidewalk. And remove my hat. And look at the ground. Why? Because looking them in the eye is disrespectful? And if they talk to you, say yes sir or yes ma'am and answer quick. And if they call you boy or nigger, don't react. Don't get angry. Just accept it." "Why?" James hesitated. He was 8. He didn't understand why. Why did he have to accept being called names? Why did he have to act inferior when his father had taught him he wasn't inferior? "Because if you don't, they might hurt you," his father said quietly. "They might hurt all of us. That's just how it is." James's father was teaching him survival, teaching him that his dignity was less important than his life, teaching him that the world would hate him for his skin and he had to accept that hatred with a smile, teaching him to be two people, the person he was at home and the person he had to be around white people. This is what Jim Crow did to children, made them learn before they could read that they were different, lesser, dangerous, made them internalize inferiority before they could even understand what that meant, made them practice subjugation like other children practiced multiplication tables. James went to school in a building that was falling apart. 45 students in one room with one teacher and textbooks so old they still had pages about President Hayes. The white school 2 blocks away had 15 students per classroom, new books every year, indoor bathrooms, a library. The white school had a bus that picked up students who lived more than a mile away. James walked 4 miles each way. Rain, shine, heat, cold. 4 miles to a school that was funded at 1/8 the rate of the white school. 4 miles to a building that wouldn't pass a basic safety inspection. 4 miles because the county had decided that black children's education wasn't worth investing in. But his teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was excellent, had a master's degree from Howard University, could have taught at a white school in the North for twice the salary, but she stayed in Mississippi because black children needed her. So she taught with broken chalk on a cracked chalkboard in a building that was freezing in winter and sweltering in summer, and she taught them to read, to write, to think, to dream of a world beyond this one. And then they'd leave school and walk past the white school with its buses and new books and indoor bathrooms and manicured lawn, and they'd understand exactly where they stood in society's hierarchy. The Washingtons were eating dinner. They were middle class by black standards. Mr. Washington worked as a Pullman porter on the railroad, made decent money, saved carefully. They owned their home, a nice 3-bedroom house in the colored section of town. But owning property as a black person meant something different than owning property as a white person. It meant your property could be seized, burned, or taken without compensation. It meant you paid property taxes, but received no city services. No garbage collection, no street paving, no street lights. The city collected taxes from black neighborhoods, but spent the money in white neighborhoods. It meant that if a white developer decided he wanted your land, you'd better sell at whatever price he offered, because if you didn't, they'd find a reason to take it. Eminent domain, zoning violations, made-up tax liens, or they'd just burn it down and call it an accident. The Washingtons knew families who'd lost everything, who'd built businesses, accumulated wealth, owned property, and watched it all disappear because white people wanted it. Tulsa's Black Wall Street in 1921. Rosewood, Florida in 1923. Dozens of other black communities burned, destroyed, erased. Thousands of families' wealth stolen, and no compensation, no justice, no prosecutions. So the Washingtons saved money in cash, hidden in the house, because they didn't fully trust banks, kept their heads down, didn't flaunt their success, didn't make white people uncomfortable with how well they were doing, because success attracted attention. Attention attracted violence. Violence attracted death. Mrs. Washington worked as a domestic servant in a white home. She cooked, cleaned, raised white children. The white children called her by her first name, Mary, even though she was 40 years old, and they were 6. She called them Master Tom and Miss Susan, even though they were children, and she was an adult. She made $3 a week. The white nanny who worked down the street doing the same job made $12. Same work, same hours, 1/4 the pay. And if Mrs. Washington complained, she'd be fired and blacklisted, and no other white family would hire her. She left her own children every morning to raise white children, fed white children before her own ate, taught white children manners while her own went to underfunded schools. And she smiled, always pleasant, always grateful for the opportunity. Because showing resentment meant unemployment. Unemployment meant poverty. Poverty meant death. This was the economic extraction of Jim Crow. Black labor at white wages, black taxes with white services, black work with white profit. The entire system was designed to extract wealth from black communities and transfer it to white communities. And it was legal, constitutional, just the way things were. Dr. Williams finished his visit to Mississippi, returned to Chicago, where he could walk on sidewalks, use bathrooms, drink from fountains, live with a fraction of the daily humiliation. But even in Chicago, he couldn't eat at most restaurants, couldn't live in most neighborhoods, couldn't join most professional organizations. Sarah Thompson wore her dress to her sister's wedding. It fit barely. She never shopped at Davison's again, saved her money, ordered clothes from catalogs designed for black customers who knew they couldn't try anything on in stores. James Cooper learned the rules, internalized them, became so good at subjugation that it became automatic, stepped off sidewalks without thinking, looked at the ground reflexively, called white children sir even when they were younger than him, survived. But something in him hardened, something broke and scarred over. He'd spend the rest of his life unlearning these reflexes, trying to reclaim the dignity his childhood had stolen. This was daily life under Jim Crow. Not lynchings and burning crosses, though those happened, but the grinding, constant, inescapable weight of being reminded every hour of every day that you were less than, that your humanity was conditional, that your existence was tolerated, not welcomed, that you lived in a cage with bars made of laws, enforced by people who wore badges and called it civilization. And the worst part? You had to survive it with your humanity intact. Had to teach your children that they were valuable, were worthy, were equal, while also teaching them to act inferior for survival. Had to maintain dignity while accepting indignity. Had to build lives, build families, build communities in a system designed to break all three. That's what the architects built. Not just laws on paper, but a daily reality where millions of people woke up every morning in a police state designed specifically to control them. Where every interaction with public space was surveilled, restricted, humiliating. Where excellence couldn't protect you, wealth couldn't protect you, education couldn't protect you, because the system wasn't based on your merit. It was based on your skin, and it was enforced every day by people with badges and guns who'd sworn oaths to uphold these laws, who believed in them, who saw themselves as heroes maintaining order, who never questioned whether the order they maintained was just. That's who we're meeting next. The enforcers, the sheriffs and deputies, and police officers who made Jim Crow function day to day, who turned legal oppression into physical reality, who wore badges while committing atrocities, who made terror official, violence legal, and murder acceptable as long as the victims were black. The cage was built. Now we need to see who guarded it. Sheriff Willis McCall woke up on Christmas morning, 1951, in his home in Lake County, Florida. He was 41 years old, well-liked in the white community, considered tough but fair, a man who kept order. He'd been sheriff for 7 years, would be sheriff for 28 years total, and during that time, he would kill more black people than anyone could count because no one bothered counting. He didn't wear a hood, didn't burn crosses in secret, didn't need to. He had a badge, and that badge gave him legal authority to do things that would get a civilian arrested, prosecuted, executed. But he wasn't a civilian. He was the law. And in Jim Crow South, the law meant whatever the sheriff said it meant. This is the part people don't understand about Jim Crow. It wasn't just terrorists in the night. It wasn't just the Klan, though they were part of it. It was the state itself, the official government, police departments, sheriff's offices, courts, all functioning exactly as designed to maintain white supremacy through legal violence. McCall had shot 2 black prisoners 3 months earlier, Samuel Shepard and Walter Irvin. They were handcuffed in his car. He claimed they attacked him, so he shot them both. Shepard died. Irvin survived and said McCall had just pulled over and started shooting. Said there was no attack, no struggle, just murder. But who was the court going to believe? A black prisoner or a white sheriff? The court believed the sheriff. Always believed the sheriff. That's how the system worked. McCall would later drag a black man, Thurgood Marshall's client, across the street in chains in front of photographers. Would shoot another prisoner while escaping. Would preside over a county where black people disappeared regularly, and no one investigated because the sheriff was the one making them disappear. And he was far from the worst. Lawrence Rainey was sheriff of Neshoba County, Mississippi in 1964. He weighed 250 pounds, carried a gun and a blackjack, and everyone in the county knew he was in the Klan. Not suspected. Knew. He didn't hide it. Didn't need to. Being in the Klan wasn't illegal. Being sheriff and being in the Klan wasn't a contradiction. It was a job requirement. On June 21st, 1964, 3 civil rights workers went missing in his county: James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner. They'd been registering black voters. Rainey's deputy, Cecil Price, had arrested them for speeding, held them in jail until nightfall, then released them. They drove away, and were never seen alive again. Rainey knew where they were. Everyone knew he knew. FBI agents questioned him. He smiled, said he didn't know nothing about it. 44 days later, they found the bodies buried in an earthen dam. All 3 had been shot. Chaney had been beaten so badly his bones were broken, his skull fractured. Rainey was charged, not with murder. The state refused to prosecute. Charged with federal civil rights violations, faced trial, and was acquitted. The all-white jury deliberated for hours because some jurors wanted to convict him of something, anything, but others refused. You don't convict a sheriff for killing civil rights workers. That's what sheriffs do. He lived free until 2002. Never spent a day in jail for murdering 3 people. Because he had a badge. And badges granted immunity. That's what the enforcers were, not the exception. The rule. Sheriffs and deputies who used their legal authority to terrorize black communities, to protect white supremacy, to make Jim Crow function through daily violence that never appeared in the statistics, because official violence doesn't count as crime. They controlled who got arrested. They controlled what charges were filed. They controlled who went to trial and who just disappeared. They controlled the chain gangs, the work camps, the prisons. They rented out prisoners to private companies and pocketed the money. They beat confessions out of people, fabricated evidence, lied in court, and faced no consequences. Because who's going to stop them? The judges? The judges were elected by all white voters who wanted exactly this kind of sheriff. The prosecutors? They worked with the sheriffs. The state government? They passed the laws the sheriffs were enforcing. The system protected itself. Every piece reinforced every other piece. Sheriffs arrested black people for made-up crimes. All white juries convicted them automatically. White judges sentenced them to chain gangs. Sheriffs leased them to companies. The companies worked them to death, and the cycle continued. In 1930s Mississippi, 40% of convict laborers died within a year. 40%. That's not prison. That's a death sentence carried out slowly. And it was legal. Constitutional. Just the criminal justice system functioning as designed. But here's what made the sheriffs particularly dangerous. They didn't just arrest people. They decided who lived and died. Because every lynching required their permission. Not explicitly, not officially, but functionally. If a sheriff wanted to stop a lynching, he could. Call in the state police, request National Guard, lock the prisoner in a secure facility, transport them to another county. There were options, but most sheriffs didn't want to stop lynchings. They wanted them to happen, sometimes participated in them, sometimes led them, and always, they made sure no one was prosecuted afterward. Because lynching wasn't illegal if no one investigated it, and sheriffs controlled the investigations. Between 1877 and 1950, at least 4,000 black Americans were lynched in the South. At least. The real number is probably double that because many lynchings went unrecorded. Many bodies were never found. Many murders were called something else. Died while escaping. Killed while resisting arrest. Accident. But 4,000 documented cases. That's one lynching every 6 days for 73 years. And that doesn't count the attempted lynchings that failed, the beatings that didn't result in death, the terrorism that didn't escalate to murder. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic terrorism. Social control through spectacular brutality. And it was public. Advertised. Celebrated. October 19th, 1934. Marianna, Florida. A white farmer was murdered. Police arrested Claude Neal, a 23-year-old black man who lived nearby. Said he confessed. The confession was beaten out of him, but that didn't matter. He'd confessed. The sheriff, knowing a lynch mob would form, transferred Neal to an Alabama jail for safety. But word spread anyway. On October 26th, a mob of several hundred white men drove to Alabama, somehow knew exactly which jail Neal was in, demanded his release. The Alabama sheriff, facing an armed mob, handed Neal over. They drove him back to Florida. And here's what makes this particularly horrifying. They announced the lynching in advance. Actually announced it. Newspapers in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida ran notices saying that Claude Neal would be lynched at 8 p.m. on October 26th near the Kennedy home. Like it was a community event, a show, entertainment. The mob tortured him for hours. The details are in newspaper accounts, in FBI reports, in testimonies. They're too graphic to describe fully, but they cut off parts of his body while he was alive. They forced him to eat them. They mutilated him systematically. And while this happened, a crowd gathered. Thousands of people. Families brought children, set up picnic blankets, like they were at a fair. After hours of torture, they hanged him, cut down his body, dragged it behind a car to the courthouse, hanged it again from a tree for display. Thousands posed for photographs next to the corpse, took pieces of his body as souvenirs, sent postcards through the U.S. mail with pictures of the lynching. No one was arrested. No one was prosecuted. The sheriff said he couldn't identify anyone in the mob. Thousands of witnesses, photographs, newspaper accounts naming organizers, and no arrests. Because lynching wasn't illegal in practice, only in theory. Mary Turner's lynching the same year, 1918 in Georgia, reveals something even darker. Her husband, Hazel Hayes Turner, was lynched first, part of a mass lynching following the murder of a white farmer. Hayes Turner may have been involved, may not have been. Didn't matter. The mob killed him anyway. Mary Turner was 8 months pregnant. When she heard about her husband's murder, she did something that white people considered unforgivable. She threatened to swear out warrants against the lynchers, said she'd press charges, said she'd seek justice. A mob of several hundred came for her. She ran. They caught her. They took her to a place called Folsom's Bridge. And what they did there was so monstrous that even some white newspapers condemned it. Though no one was prosecuted, they hung her upside down by her ankles, set her clothes on fire. Then, while she was still alive, still conscious, someone cut her abdomen open. They cut her baby from her body. The baby, born this way, cried. Someone stomped on its head, crushed it to death. Then they shot Mary Turner's body hundreds of times. This happened in daylight, with hundreds of witnesses, in 1918, just over 100 years ago. And no one was arrested. No one was prosecuted. The coroner's report said the baby had never lived because that made the legal situation simpler, made it one murder instead of two. Not that it mattered, since no one was charged with either. What Mary Turner had done wrong, what got her killed, was demanding justice, threatening to hold white men accountable for murdering her husband. That was too uppity, too much, too threatening to the order of things. So they killed her and her unborn child in the most brutal way imaginable to send a message. Don't seek justice. Don't demand accountability. Don't challenge white supremacy even when it murders your family. The message was received. Across the South, black communities understood. The law won't protect you. The courts won't help you. The sheriffs are your enemies. The only safety is silence, submission, and constant vigilance. But sometimes even that wasn't enough. Sometimes you could follow every rule, stay completely respectful, do everything right, and still die. Elmore Bowling came home from World War II in 1946. He'd served his country, fought against fascism in Europe, earned his uniform. He wore it home to Minden, Louisiana. Wore it downtown. Because he'd earned it. Because he was proud. Because wearing a military uniform shouldn't be dangerous. It was dangerous. White men saw him in his uniform. Saw a black man in military dress, walking with confidence, acting like he had rights. They called him uppity. Said he needed to learn his place. The police were called, not to protect Bowling, to arrest him for disturbing the peace. They took him to jail. Officially, he died of injuries sustained while resisting arrest. Unofficially, everyone knew. They beat him to death. Beat him so badly, his body was unrecognizable. Beat him because he'd worn his uniform, because he'd served his country, because he'd forgotten that military service didn't make him equal in Louisiana. No one was charged. His family was threatened not to pursue it. The case was closed as accidental death in custody. This happened to multiple black veterans after World War II. Men who'd fought for democracy abroad came home to find they had no democracy at home. Who'd defeated Hitler's racial regime, but lived under America's racial regime. Who'd worn uniforms that should have been respected, but made them targets. The lynchings had patterns, had reasons. Not good reasons, not moral reasons, but consistent reasons that reveal the actual function of this terrorism. Most common justification: murder. Usually a black man accused of killing a white person. Sometimes guilty, often not. Didn't matter. No trial, just mob justice. Because the actual crime wasn't murder. The actual crime was forgetting the hierarchy, and the punishment was death without due process. Second most common, inappropriate behavior toward a white woman. This could mean rape, though false accusations were common. Could mean consensual relationships, which were illegal. Could mean just speaking to a white woman, or looking at one, or existing near one. The accusation alone was enough. No evidence needed. No trial. Just accusation and death. Third, economic success. This one's important because it reveals the economic function of lynching. Black man becomes too successful, owns too much land, makes too much money, threatens white economic dominance, gets accused of something, anything, gets lynched. His property is seized. His wealth disappears. His competition is eliminated. This happened constantly. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, 1921. The Greenwood District, the wealthiest black community in America. Successful businesses, doctors, lawyers, shops, theaters. White Tulsans looked at it and saw a threat, so they burned it, killed hundreds, destroyed 35 blocks, arrested the survivors for inciting a riot. No one was prosecuted for the massacre, but hundreds of black residents were prosecuted for defending themselves. The message: you can build wealth, but we can destroy it whenever we want. So don't build too much. Don't succeed too visibly. Don't forget your place. Rosewood, Florida, 1923. Similar story. Prosperous black town. Successful families. Then a white woman claimed a black man attacked her. Probably false, certainly unproven. Didn't matter. White mobs from surrounding towns descended, burned every building, killed dozens. The town ceased to exist. The state of Florida did nothing. No prosecutions, no compensation. The town was just erased, and the lesson was clear. Success makes you a target. Prosperity attracts violence. Building wealth puts a target on your community. That's the economic function of lynching. Not just punishment, not just terrorism, but wealth extraction, elimination of economic competition, enforcement of economic hierarchy. Can't have black people accumulating too much wealth, owning too much property, competing too successfully. So you kill them and take what they built. Call it maintaining order. Call it justice. Call it whatever lets you sleep at night. And it was legal. In practice, if not in theory. Because sheriffs didn't investigate. Prosecutors didn't charge. Juries didn't convict. Governors didn't intervene. The federal government tried, occasionally. Anti-lynching bills were introduced in Congress repeatedly between 1900 and 1950. All failed. The South filibustered them, blocked them, killed the legislation before it could kill the lynchings. President after president refused to take action, couldn't risk losing Southern votes, couldn't challenge Southern senators, couldn't prioritize black lives over white political power. So the lynchings continued, decade after decade, generation after generation, with federal sanction through federal silence. The photographs are the worst part. Not the worst morally. The murders themselves are the worst morally. But the photographs reveal something about white supremacy that's hard to process. They show crowds, families, children, people smiling, people posing next to charred bodies, next to hanging corpses, next to mutilated remains. And they're smiling. They made postcards, actual postcards, sent them through the mail. Wish you were here, written on the back of a photograph showing a burned body. Sent to relatives, to friends, to people up north, like souvenirs from vacation. What kind of society produces that? What kind of system makes people comfortable posing for photographs next to murdered bodies? What kind of culture makes that acceptable, celebratory, normal? The answer is one where black humanity has been so thoroughly denied that black death becomes entertainment. One where the legal system, the religious system, the educational system, the entire social structure has reinforced the idea that black people aren't fully human, aren't deserving of rights, dignity, life, are things that can be disposed of when convenient. And the sheriffs, the deputies, the police, the entire apparatus of law enforcement reinforced this daily. They arrested black people for existing. They beat confessions. They fabricated evidence. They protected lynchers. They sometimes led lynchings. And they did it all under color of law, wearing badges, with salaries paid by taxpayers, with authority granted by the state. That's what made Jim Crow function. Not just laws on paper, not just segregation, but violence. Constant, systematic, state-sanctioned violence. Violence that was legal when performed by men with badges. Violence that was celebrated when performed by mobs. Violence that was photographed, postcarded, displayed proudly because the perpetrators knew they'd face no consequences. Willis McCall died in 1994. Never spent a day in jail. Lived to be 84 years old. Killed dozens of people, probably more. Was finally voted out of office in 1972, but not for his murders. For corruption, for financial crimes, for stealing county money. That's what finally mattered to voters. Not the black people he'd murdered. The money he'd stolen. Lawrence Rainey died in 2002. Never convicted. Never imprisoned. Lived free his entire life. The families of the men he murdered got nothing. No justice. No compensation. No acknowledgement that what happened to their loved ones was wrong. That's the legacy of the enforcers. Men who wore badges while committing atrocities. Who used legal authority to terrorize communities. Who made Jim Crow functional through daily violence, who turned a legal system into a murder machine and called it law and order. And they weren't exceptions. They were the rule. Most sheriffs in the Jim Crow South weren't secretly sympathetic to civil rights. They were true believers in white supremacy who used their badges to enforce it violently. They weren't good men trapped in a bad system. They were the system. They built it, maintained it, defended it, and profited from it. Understanding this is crucial, because when people talk about Jim Crow, they often focus on laws, on segregation, on disenfranchisement, and those things were horrible. But what made them enforceable, what made them functional, was violence. Legal violence performed by people with badges, extra-legal violence protected by those same people, and a federal government that looked the other way for 70 years. That's the cage. Laws built it. Sheriffs guarded it. Violence maintained it. And anyone who challenged it faced death. But people challenged it anyway. That's what's remarkable. That's what we need to see next. Because for all the violence, for all the terror, for all the systematic oppression, Black Americans resisted. Built institutions, created wealth, fought back. Sometimes with arms, sometimes with law, sometimes with economics. Always with courage that's hard to comprehend when you understand what they were facing. They lived in a police state designed to break them, and they refused to break. Built communities, businesses, universities, culture. Built excellence in a system designed to make excellence impossible. And in doing so, proved that the entire architecture of Jim Crow was built on lies. That's where we're going next, to the resistance, to the builders, to the people who looked at this cage and decided to break it or die trying. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company held its quarterly board meeting in 1920. 15 men in expensive suits discussing profit margins, expansion plans, operational efficiency. Someone raised a question about their colored cars, the separate cars mandated by law for black passengers. "They're costing us money," one board member said. "We're running extra cars, hiring extra porters, maintaining duplicate facilities. It would be cheaper to integrate." The chairman nodded. "Cheaper, yes, but we charge the same fare for inferior service. We pack more colored passengers per car. We don't maintain those cars as well, so costs are lower. And politically, we can't integrate. The state would revoke our charter. So we keep the system, we keep the profits, and we let the colored passengers subsidize white comfort." That's what Jim Crow was, economically. Not just racism, profitable racism. A business model built on charging Black Americans more for less, while extracting their wealth and labor at every level. Northern companies, Southern companies, they all participated. They all profited. And they all fought to maintain the system, because integration would hurt their bottom line. The railroads were just the beginning. Every industry found ways to extract extra profit from segregation. Insurance companies charged black customers higher premiums for the same coverage. Their actuarial tables were explicitly racial. Black life insurance cost 20 to 30% more than white life insurance, even controlling for income and health. The companies claimed black people died younger, lived riskier lives. And they died younger because they had less access to healthcare, lived in poorly maintained housing, worked more dangerous jobs. The very oppression that shortened black lives was used to justify charging them more for insurance. Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, one of the largest in America, had explicit racial policies. They insured black customers, but in separate policies, with separate agents at higher rates. They calculated that discrimination was profitable, and they were right. Between 1900 and 1950, they extracted millions in excess premiums from black customers who had no other options. North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company was founded in 1898 by black entrepreneurs, specifically because white insurance companies either wouldn't insure black customers or charged them exploitative rates. It became one of the most successful black-owned businesses in America. But think about what that means. Black people had to create parallel institutions because white institutions discriminated, and then white people pointed to those separate institutions as evidence that segregation was working, that black people preferred their own institutions. Banking was worse. White banks wouldn't give mortgages to black borrowers in white neighborhoods, wouldn't give business loans to black entrepreneurs, wouldn't give personal loans at reasonable rates. And when they did lend to black customers, the interest rates were higher, the terms shorter, the collateral requirements stricter. Redlining wasn't invented in the 1960s. It started decades earlier. Banks drew literal red lines around black neighborhoods and refused to lend there. The Federal Housing Administration, a government agency, made it official policy in the 1930s. Their underwriting manual explicitly said that neighborhoods should be racially homogeneous, that mixing races would reduce property values, that black presence made areas risky investments. So black families couldn't get mortgages to buy homes in appreciating neighborhoods, were forced to rent or buy in redlined areas where property values stayed flat or declined, couldn't accumulate wealth through home ownership, which is how most American families built wealth in the 20th century. And this was government policy. Federal law. The United States government actively preventing black Americans from building wealth. The economics of daily shopping were extractive too. Black customers paid more for everything. Department stores charged black customers higher prices for the same goods, or sold them lower quality goods at the same prices. Grocery stores in black neighborhoods charged more for food. Landlords charged higher rent for worse housing. Every transaction was an opportunity to extract extra profit. And black customers couldn't shop around easily. Couldn't just go to white neighborhoods where prices might be lower because they weren't welcome there. Couldn't try on clothes in most stores. Couldn't return merchandise. Had limited options, and businesses exploited that captivity. Sears and Montgomery Ward made millions selling to black customers through mail order catalogs. Black families ordered from catalogs because they couldn't shop in stores without humiliation. The catalogs didn't discriminate, didn't have separate entrances, didn't have salespeople calling you names, just order numbers and prices. So black families paid premium prices plus shipping to avoid the indignity of in-person shopping. But some black entrepreneurs looked at this discrimination and saw opportunity. If white businesses wouldn't serve black customers fairly, black businesses could. If the system was extractive, maybe you could build wealth by serving your own community. Arthur George Gaston was born in 1892 in Alabama. His mother was a cook, his father absent. He had nothing, started with nothing, but he understood something crucial. Black people needed services, and white businesses either wouldn't provide them or would provide them exploitatively. There was a market, a captive market. If you could serve it fairly, you could build an empire. He started small. While working at a coal mine, he noticed that when black workers died, their families couldn't afford funerals. So he started a burial society. Workers paid 25 cents a week. When someone died, the society paid for the funeral. Simple, but it worked. Within a few years, he had hundreds of members, thousands of dollars in reserves. He used that money to start Smith and Gaston Funeral Home in 1923. He was 31 years old, in Birmingham, Alabama, in the heart of Jim Crow, and he was going to build a business empire. White funeral homes wouldn't serve black families or charge them exploitative prices. Gaston charged fair prices, treated families with dignity. His business grew. Within 5 years, he had the most successful black funeral home in Alabama. But Gaston was thinking bigger. He noticed that the burial insurance he was selling through his funeral home was profitable. Very profitable. So in 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression, he founded Booker T. Washington Insurance Company. Black families needed insurance. White companies charged them excessive rates. Gaston would charge fair rates and still make profit because his overhead was lower. His understanding of the community was better. It worked. By 1940, Booker T. Washington Insurance had policies across Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. Gaston was making real money, not surviving, thriving, in Jim Crow, Alabama, during the Depression, as a black man who'd started with nothing. He kept building, noticed that black people couldn't get business loans from white banks. So in 1957, he founded Citizens Federal Savings and Loan, a black-owned bank that would lend to black entrepreneurs, give mortgages to black families, invest in black communities. The bank became one of the largest black-owned financial institutions in America. He built the A.G. Gaston Motel in Birmingham. Black travelers couldn't stay at white hotels. The Green Book, a guide for black travelers, listed safe places to stay, but those places were often small, poorly maintained, expensive, Gaston built a first-class motel. Nice rooms, good service, fair prices. It became the place where black travelers stayed in Birmingham. Dr. King stayed there during the Birmingham campaign. It was bombed in 1963 by white supremacists. Gaston rebuilt it. He built a construction company, a radio station, a cemetery, a business college. By the 1960s, he was worth millions. In Birmingham, in Alabama, under Jim Crow. He employed hundreds of people, fed thousands of families, built an empire in a system designed to make black wealth impossible. But here's the complication. Gaston succeeded by serving a segregated market. His businesses existed because segregation created demand for black-owned services. Integration threatened his business model. If black people could stay at any hotel, why stay at his? If they could get insurance from any company, why use his? So Gaston opposed some civil rights tactics. Not civil rights itself. He funded the movement, let Dr. King use his motel, supported voter registration. But he opposed the Birmingham campaign's economic boycotts because they hurt black businesses too. He urged moderation, negotiation, slow change, because rapid change threatened the empire he'd built. Was he a sellout or a pragmatist? Was he wrong to build wealth under oppression? Or smart to recognize that oppression created economic opportunities if you knew how to navigate it? These aren't simple questions. Gaston employed hundreds of black workers who wouldn't have had jobs otherwise. He loaned money to black entrepreneurs who couldn't get loans elsewhere. He built institutions that served black communities. But he also benefited from segregation, made millions because white businesses wouldn't serve black customers, built his fortune on the same system that oppressed his community. And this was the bind for every black entrepreneur under Jim Crow. Success required navigating the system, playing by its rules, not challenging it too directly, because challenging it meant losing everything. Ask the black business owners in Tulsa, in Rosewood, in dozens of other communities that were destroyed when they became too successful, too visible, too threatening. So black entrepreneurs walked a tightrope. Build wealth, but not too much. Succeed, but not too visibly. Challenge the system, but not too directly. And always, always know that everything you built could be destroyed tomorrow if white people decided you'd gotten too uppity. The Green Book economy itself reveals this reality. Victor Hugo Green, a black postal worker in Harlem, published the first Negro Motorist Green Book in 1936. It was a guide to safe places for black travelers. Hotels that would rent to them. Restaurants that would serve them. Gas stations that would sell to them. Sundown towns to avoid. Places where black people had to be out by sunset or risk violence. The fact that this guide was necessary, that it sold millions of copies, that black families couldn't travel without it, reveals the economic segregation of Jim Crow. But it also created a market. Black-owned hotels, restaurants, gas stations advertised in the Green Book, built their businesses serving black travelers who couldn't stop elsewhere. Made money because segregation created captive markets. Was that entrepreneurship or exploitation? Both. Neither. Just survival in a system that offered no good options. And Northern companies profited too. This wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. Woolworths, founded in Pennsylvania, had segregated lunch counters across the South. Black customers could buy merchandise, but couldn't sit at the lunch counter. The company made the calculation. Southern white customers matter more than black customers, so we'll segregate. Coca-Cola, based in Atlanta, had explicit policies about marketing to black customers. Different bottle sizes, different pricing, different advertising. They studied the Negro market the way they studied any market segment, calculated how to extract maximum profit while maintaining segregation. Ford Motor Company, the ultimate Northern industrial corporation, had segregated facilities in its Southern plants. Black workers got the worst jobs, the lowest pay, the most dangerous positions, and Ford marketed itself as progressive for hiring black workers at all. Northern wealth was built on Southern oppression. Northern companies sold goods to Southern plantations, financed Southern agriculture, insured Southern businesses. made loans secured by black lives under slavery and black labor under Jim Crow. Wall Street financed the entire system. New York banks held mortgages on Southern property. Boston insurance companies insured Southern crops. Philadelphia manufacturers sold equipment to Southern companies that used convict labor. The entire American economy was intertwined with Jim Crow. You couldn't separate them. Northern companies might not have passed segregation laws, but they profited from them. Northern banks might not have disenfranchised black voters, but they financed the system that did. And after Jim Crow fell, after integration, all that extracted wealth stayed where it was. The wealth gap created by 70 years of economic oppression didn't close. Black families who'd been denied mortgages, charged higher prices, paid lower wages, excluded from good jobs, that accumulated disadvantage didn't disappear just because the laws changed. A.G. Gaston died in 1996, worth about $130 million. He'd built that wealth under Jim Crow, through Jim Crow, because of Jim Crow in some ways. His success proved that black excellence was possible even under oppression, but it also revealed how rare that success was. How extraordinary you had to be to overcome systematic economic extraction. How much genius and luck and persistence it took to build wealth when the entire system was designed to prevent it. For every Gaston, there were thousands of black entrepreneurs who failed, who had their businesses burned, who couldn't get loans, who succeeded locally, but could never expand because white businesses and white governments blocked them, who built something and watched it get destroyed because they'd become too successful, too visible, too much of a threat. That's the economics of Jim Crow. Not just segregation. Extraction. Systematic, legal, profitable extraction of wealth from black communities to white communities. Through higher prices, lower wages, worse services, blocked opportunities, stolen property, destroyed businesses, and 70 years of compounding disadvantage. The laws created the cage, the violence maintained it, but the economics made it profitable, made it sustainable, made white people, North and South, invested in maintaining it because they benefited from it, made integration threatening not just to racist ideology, but to actual bank accounts, actual businesses, actual fortunes built on paying black workers less and charging black customers more. And when we talk about reparations, about the wealth gap, about why black Americans have 1/10 the median wealth of white Americans today, this is why. Not ancient history, not slavery that ended 160 years ago. This, Jim Crow, 70 years of legal economic extraction that ended within living memory, that built white wealth and destroyed black wealth, that Northern companies and Southern companies both profited from. That created fortunes that still exist, that were passed down, that continue to generate wealth today. That's what the architects built. Not just laws, an economic system, a machine for transferring wealth from black communities to white communities. For 70 years, legally, constitutionally, with banks and insurance companies and railroads and retailers all participating, all profiting, all defending the system because integration would hurt their bottom line. But while this extraction was happening, while white businesses were profiting from oppression, black Americans were building anyway, creating anyway, resisting anyway. That's what we're seeing next. The people who looked at this economic system designed to break them and decided to build excellence anyway, to fight back, to prove that no amount of oppression could destroy their humanity, their capability, their determination to be free. Ida B. Wells was 30 years old when she bought a pistol. This was 1892 in Memphis, Tennessee. She was a teacher, a journalist, part owner of a black newspaper called Free Speech and Headlight. She was educated, articulate, respected in the black community, and she'd just received a death threat from white men who wanted her silent. 3 of her friends had been lynched 2 weeks earlier. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, Will Stewart. They'd owned a grocery store in a black neighborhood, People's Grocery. It was successful. Too successful. It competed with a white-owned grocery nearby. The white owner didn't like losing business to black entrepreneurs, so he started a confrontation, claimed the black men were threatening him, called in white allies. The black store owners, knowing what was coming, armed themselves. When white men attacked their store, they fired back, shot and wounded 3 white men. Didn't kill anyone. But they'd committed the unforgivable sin. They'd defended themselves. They'd shot white men. They were arrested, jailed, and 3 nights later, a white mob took them from the jail. The sheriff let it happen. Always let it happen. The mob took them outside the city limits and shot them to death. Left their bodies on the ground. Ida B. Wells investigated, wrote articles, interviewed witnesses, and discovered something that white Memphis didn't want known. This wasn't about crime. This was about economics. Thomas Moss and his partners were killed because their business was successful, because they were competing with white businesses, because black economic success threatened white economic dominance. She wrote this in her newspaper, wrote that lynching was economic terrorism dressed up as law enforcement, wrote that white men lynched successful black men to steal their property and eliminate competition, wrote the truth, and white Memphis lost its mind. How dare a black woman accuse white men of economic motives? How dare she investigate lynchings like she had authority? How dare she publish these accusations like she had rights? A white mob destroyed her newspaper office, destroyed the printing press, published threats saying that if she returned to Memphis, she'd be killed. Specifically said they'd hang her from a lamppost in front of the courthouse. She was in Philadelphia when it happened. Got word not to come back. That they were waiting for her. That her life was over if she set foot in Memphis again. She could have stopped. Could have stayed silent. Could have accepted that speaking truth was too dangerous. But she didn't. She kept investigating lynchings. Kept publishing the results. Kept speaking across the country about what was really happening in the South. And she added something that shocked white audiences. She advocated armed self-defense. She said it plainly. A Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give. This wasn't respectable. This wasn't acceptable. Black people weren't supposed to advocate violence. Weren't supposed to arm themselves. Weren't supposed to fight back. They were supposed to be victims. Patient victims. Nonviolent victims. Victims who waited for white people to grant them rights. But Wells said no. She said that if the law won't protect you, protect yourself. If white men can lynch you with impunity, shoot them first. If the state won't give you justice, take power. Make yourself too dangerous to attack casually. Make white supremacists calculate the cost before they try to kill you. And here's what's remarkable. It worked sometimes. Not always. Not even most of the time, but sometimes. In 1946, in Monroe, North Carolina, a black veteran named Robert F. Williams returned from World War II. He'd fought against fascism in Europe. Came home to find fascism waiting for him in North Carolina. The Klan was active. Lynchings were common. Black people had no protection from law enforcement because law enforcement was often the Klan. Williams became president of the local NAACP chapter, started organizing voter registration, challenged segregation, and armed his community. He didn't hide it. He openly recruited black veterans to form armed self-defense groups. They had rifles, shotguns, military training. They set up watch points around the black neighborhood. And when the Klan tried to attack, they shot back. October 1957. The Klan organized a motorcade through the black neighborhood, trying to intimidate, trying to terrorize. Dozens of cars, full of armed white men, driving slowly through black streets, shouting threats, firing shots in the air. Williams and his group were waiting. When the Klan motorcade reached a certain point, they opened fire. Not into the crowd, over their heads. Warning shots, demonstrating capacity, showing that this neighborhood was defended. The Klan fled, scattered, never came back to that neighborhood in force again, because they'd learned something crucial. Terrorism works best against unarmed populations, against people who can't fight back. But when the targets shoot back, when they're organized and armed and willing to defend themselves, terrorism becomes too costly. The FBI investigated Williams for this, not the Klan for terrorizing a neighborhood, Williams for defending it. He was eventually forced to flee the country, ended up in Cuba, then China. But for those years in Monroe, he proved something important. Armed self-defense could work. Couldn't solve everything, couldn't overthrow Jim Crow, but could make specific communities safer. Could make white supremacists think twice. The Deacons for Defense in Louisiana did the same thing in the 1960s. Black men, many of them veterans, formed armed groups to protect civil rights workers. They carried weapons openly, escorted organizers, made it clear that attacking civil rights workers meant facing armed resistance. Did it stop all violence? No. Civil rights workers were still murdered, but it stopped some violence, made some attacks more difficult, provided protection that law enforcement refused to provide. This history makes people uncomfortable. We want the civil rights movement to be purely nonviolent. Want Martin Luther King's philosophy to be the only philosophy. Want black resistance to be respectable, patient, peaceful. But the reality was more complicated. Many communities practiced armed self-defense. Many civil rights leaders, including Dr. King at certain points, kept guns in their homes. Nonviolence was a tactic, sometimes a philosophy, but it existed alongside armed self-defense, not instead of it. And we need to understand this because otherwise we miss something crucial about resistance under Jim Crow. It was multifaceted. Some people resisted through law, some through economics, some through culture, some through arms, and all of it was necessary. All of it was brave. All of it risked death. Harry T. Moore understood this. He was an NAACP organizer in Florida. Never carried a gun. Never advocated violence. His weapon was voter registration. He traveled across Florida registering black voters. Founded NAACP chapters. Investigated lynchings. Fought legally, non-violently, through the system. He knew he was being watched. Knew the Klan had him marked. Knew that organizing black voters made him a target. But he kept doing it because someone had to. Because rights don't appear through patience. They're taken through action. Christmas Day, 1951. Harry T. Moore and his wife Harriet were home celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children were grown, visiting for the holidays. At 9 p.m., a bomb exploded under their bedroom. The house collapsed. Harry died immediately. Harriet died 9 days later. The FBI investigated, found that the Klan had planted the bomb, knew who did it, had names, had evidence. But no one was prosecuted, not one person. Because this was Florida in 1951, and killing NAACP organizers wasn't really a crime. Not in practice. Not when the victims were black and the killers were white. Harry T. Moore became the first NAACP official murdered for civil rights work. Not the last, but the first. His death sent a message. Organize black voters, and we'll kill you. Fight for rights, and we'll kill your wife too. Work within the system, and we'll murder you anyway. But the message wasn't received the way they intended, because Harry T. Moore's death didn't stop the movement. It energized it, made more people realize that peaceful work within the system was just as dangerous as armed resistance. That white supremacists would kill you regardless of your tactics, so you might as well fight with everything you had. And while some black Americans were resisting with weapons, others were resisting with excellence. Building institutions, creating culture, accumulating wealth, demonstrating capacity, proving through achievement what the law denied, that they were fully human, fully capable, fully deserving of equal rights. The historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, were revolutionary institutions built under oppression. Howard University, Morehouse, Spelman, Tuskegee, Fisk, Hampton, dozens more. They were founded after the Civil War because white universities wouldn't admit black students. And instead of accepting exclusion, black communities built their own universities. These weren't inferior institutions. They were often superior because they had to be, because their graduates faced a world that assumed black inferiority. So they had to be twice as good to be considered half as acceptable. The standards were higher, the expectations greater, the pressure immense, and they succeeded anyway. W.E.B. Du Bois graduated from Fisk, became the first black person to earn a PhD from Harvard. Thurgood Marshall graduated from Howard Law, became the lawyer who dismantled Jim Crow legally, then became a Supreme Court justice. Martin Luther King Jr. graduated from Morehouse. These institutions trained the minds that would eventually destroy the system that tried to destroy them. But even excellence couldn't protect you from Jim Crow's daily humiliations. George Washington Carver was one of the most brilliant scientists in American history. His agricultural research revolutionized Southern farming. He developed hundreds of uses for peanuts, sweet potatoes, soybeans. His work saved Southern agriculture. White farmers used his techniques, made millions from his innovations. He was internationally respected, famous, honored by presidents, and he still had to use the colored bathroom, still couldn't eat at white restaurants, still faced discrimination at train stations. His genius couldn't overcome his skin color in Jim Crow's America. Madam C.J. Walker became the first female self-made millionaire in America. She built a beauty empire during Jim Crow, developed hair care products for black women, employed thousands, built a mansion, made a fortune, and couldn't stay in most hotels because they were whites only. Her money couldn't buy her entry to white spaces. Her success couldn't earn her equality. Hattie McDaniel won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in 1940 for her role in Gone with the Wind, the first black person to win an Oscar. Historic achievement, recognition of her talent, and she couldn't sit with the white cast members at the ceremony. The hotel hosting the Oscars was segregated. She had to sit at a separate table, away from everyone else, because her Oscar couldn't integrate the room. Think about that. You can be the best in your field, can win the highest award, can achieve what no one like you has achieved before, and still can't sit with your colleagues because Jim Crow says you're inferior regardless of your excellence. But the excellence continued anyway. The Harlem Renaissance happened during Jim Crow. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Josephine Baker, black artists creating culture that would define America, creating jazz, blues, literature, art that white people would later claim as American culture, while denying the humanity of the people who created it. And some of that culture was funded by illegal money. Remember the Harlem Numbers racket from earlier? Casper Holstein used gambling profits to fund the Harlem Renaissance, paid for Langston Hughes' first book of poetry, funded cultural awards, bought buildings so black families could own property, illegal money creating legal excellence, crime funding culture, the contradiction at the heart of black survival under oppression. Because that's what Jim Crow forced. Contradictions. You had to navigate illegal and legal simultaneously, had to build wealth through whatever means available while maintaining respectability, had to resist while surviving, had to accept daily humiliation while maintaining dignity, had to teach your children they were equal while teaching them to act inferior, had to be two people simultaneously, the person you were and the person Jim Crow forced you to be. Black Wall Street in Tulsa was built during Jim Crow. The Greenwood District was the wealthiest black community in America by 1921. Black-owned businesses, banks, newspapers, theaters, hospitals. Black doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs. People who'd built wealth despite systematic oppression. Who'd created a thriving economy in a segregated neighborhood because segregation created captive markets. And then, white Tulsa burned it to the ground, killed hundreds, destroyed 35 blocks, eliminated $1.5 million in property damage in 1921 dollars, tens of millions today, because black excellence was threatening, black wealth was dangerous, black success challenged the entire ideology of white supremacy. If black people could build this much wealth despite oppression, what did that say about white supremacist claims of black inferiority? If black businesses could thrive, if black professionals could succeed, If black communities could prosper, then the entire justification for Jim Crow collapsed. So the wealth had to be destroyed. The success had to be eliminated. The evidence had to be burned. The residents of Greenwood rebuilt. Not to the same level, not with the same wealth, but they rebuilt. Because that's what black Americans did under Jim Crow. They built. And when white supremacists destroyed what they built again, and again, and again, until the building itself became an act of resistance, until excellence became a weapon, until achievement became a form of protest. The Negro Leagues existed because Major League Baseball was segregated. Black players couldn't play in the majors regardless of talent, so they created their own league, and it was better. The talent level was higher. The players were more skilled. Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, they were better than most white major leaguers. Everyone knew it, but they couldn't play in the majors because baseball valued whiteness over excellence. When Jackie Robinson finally broke the color barrier in 1947, he wasn't the best player in the Negro Leagues. He was good, but there were better. He was chosen because Branch Rickey thought he had the temperament to withstand the abuse he'd face. The racial slurs, the death threats, the violence. Robinson had to be good enough to compete and strong enough to endure. And he was. He succeeded despite pitchers throwing at his head, despite base runners trying to spike him, despite fans threatening to kill him, despite hotels refusing him rooms, despite teammates initially refusing to play with him. He succeeded, and his success opened the door for others. But it shouldn't have required superhuman excellence just to be allowed to play baseball. That's what Jim Crow demanded. Be twice as good for half the recognition. This was the pattern under Jim Crow. Excellence wasn't rewarded. It was punished until it became undeniable. And even when it became undeniable, it was still restricted, still segregated, still denied full recognition. You could be George Washington Carver and still use the colored bathroom. Could be Madam C.J. Walker and still be denied hotel rooms. Could be Hattie McDaniel and still sit at a separate table at your own award ceremony. But the excellence continued. The building continued. The resistance through achievement continued. Because if white supremacy said black people were inferior, then black excellence was an act of rebellion. If Jim Crow said black people couldn't succeed, then every black success was a victory. If the system was designed to break black humanity, then maintaining humanity was revolutionary. That's what the architects of Jim Crow didn't understand. They thought legal oppression would break black spirit. Thought systematic discrimination would convince black Americans of their own inferiority. Thought that if you denied people rights long enough, they'd accept their denial as natural. But it didn't work. Not completely. Not permanently. Because you can oppress people, but you can't make them believe they deserve oppression. You can deny them rights, but you can't make them accept that denial as just. You can humiliate them daily, but you can't destroy their dignity entirely. So black Americans built HBCUs when white universities excluded them, built businesses when white businesses discriminated, created culture when white society tried to erase them, armed themselves when law enforcement wouldn't protect them, registered voters when voting was death-defying, organized communities when organizing was illegal, resisted in every way available, legally, economically, culturally, physically. And all of it was dangerous. All of it risked death. Harry T. Moore registered voters and was murdered. The residents of Tulsa built wealth and watched it burn. Robert F. Williams armed his community and had to flee the country. Ida B. Wells told the truth and was exiled. Excellence was punished. Success was attacked. Resistance was met with violence. But they did it anyway. That's what's remarkable. That's what the next generation needs to understand. Jim Crow wasn't just something that happened to black Americans. It was something they fought against daily, hourly, constantly, through legal challenges and armed defense, through building institutions and creating culture, through excellence that couldn't be denied even when it was suppressed. And eventually, that resistance would crack the system, would create enough pressure that Jim Crow couldn't sustain itself, would prove that oppression, no matter how legal, how systematic, how violently enforced, couldn't last forever against people determined to be free. That's where we're going next. To the moment when the cracks became breaks. When World War II changed everything. When black veterans returned, unwilling to accept Jim Crow. When the federal government finally, slowly, began to acknowledge that American apartheid was incompatible with American democracy. When the cage the architects built so carefully began to show its weaknesses. The war is coming, and it's going to change everything. Private First Class Isaac Woodard stepped off a Greyhound bus in Batesburg, South Carolina on February 12, 1946. He was 27 years old. He'd been in the Army for 15 months, served in the Pacific, earned a battle star, been honorably discharged 3 hours earlier. He was still wearing his uniform, still had his discharge papers in his pocket, still thought, somehow, that military service might earn him some measure of respect. He'd asked the bus driver if there was time to use the restroom at the last stop. The driver, a white man named Alton Blackwell, cursed at him, called him names, told him to sit down and shut up. Woodard sat down, said nothing else. Kept quiet for the rest of the trip because that's what you did as a black man in the South, even in uniform, even after serving your country. When the bus reached Batesburg, the driver got off and found the police chief, Linwood Shull. Told him there was a drunk and disorderly Negro soldier on the bus causing problems. This was a lie. Woodard wasn't drunk, hadn't caused any problems, had just asked to use a bathroom, but the driver's word was enough. Chief Shull and another officer boarded the bus, demanded Woodard get off. He complied, asked what he'd done wrong. Shull didn't answer, just told him to come to the police station. Woodard went, still in his uniform, still thinking this was some misunderstanding that could be cleared up. At the station, Shull asked if Woodard had been discharged that day. Woodard said yes, showed his papers. Shull looked at them. Then he started beating him, used his nightstick, hit him repeatedly. Woodard tried to defend himself. That made it worse. Shull took him to a cell, kept beating him, then took the end of his nightstick and drove it into Woodard's eyes, both eyes, deliberately, gouging them, destroying them. Woodard screamed, begged him to stop. Shull kept going. When he was finished, Isaac Woodard was permanently blind, would never see again. His eyes were destroyed. His life was destroyed. 3 hours after being honorably discharged from the United States Army, he was charged with drunk and disorderly conduct, convicted by an all-white jury despite no evidence of drunkenness. Fined $50. No one was charged with assaulting him. Chief Shull kept his job, kept his badge, remained a police officer for years after blinding a veteran for asking to use a bathroom. But Isaac Woodard's blinding did something unusual. It created national outrage. Not in the South. In the South, it was just another day. Another black man who'd forgotten his place. Another example of why black people needed to be kept in line. But in the North, people were horrified. A veteran, still in uniform, blinded by police for no reason. This was who we were as a country? The NAACP publicized the case. Orson Welles talked about it on his radio show. Woody Guthrie wrote a song about it. President Truman heard about it, and something shifted. Not completely, not immediately, but something. Because World War II had changed the calculation. 1 million black Americans had served in the military. They'd fought against Hitler's racial regime, against fascism, against the idea that some people were superior because of their blood. They'd defeated that ideology in Europe, and then they came home to Jim Crow. They came home to segregated buses, segregated schools, segregated everything. Came home to being called boy by white teenagers. Came home to a country that had used them to fight for democracy abroad, but denied them democracy at home. And many of them were no longer willing to accept it. The WWII campaign during the war had been about this: victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home. Black newspapers had promoted it. Black soldiers had believed in it. They'd thought, maybe naively, that serving their country would earn them citizenship, would earn them rights, would prove they were equal. Instead, they came home to violence. Dozens of black veterans were lynched in the immediate post-war years. Some while still in uniform. Some for wearing their uniforms too proudly. Some for voting or trying to vote. Some for no reason at all except that they'd served and therefore thought they had rights. But something was different now. The federal government, slowly, reluctantly, began to pay attention. Not because they suddenly cared about black Americans, but because the Cold War had started. The Soviet Union was pointing to American racism as proof that American democracy was a lie. Countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America were watching. The United States couldn't claim to be the leader of the free world while maintaining apartheid at home. So President Truman, who was personally racist, who used racial slurs in private, who believed in segregation, made a calculation. Political, not moral. He needed black voters in northern cities. Needed to blunt Soviet propaganda. Needed to do something about the most visible aspects of American racism. On July 26, 1948, he signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States military. Not immediately, not completely. The order was vague, said the military should move toward equality of treatment as rapidly as possible. It would take years to fully implement. The Marines resisted until 1952. But the order was issued. The principle was established. For the first time since Reconstruction, the federal government had taken direct action against segregation. The South erupted. Southern governors called it tyranny. Southern senators threatened to filibuster everything. Strom Thurmond, senator from South Carolina, ran for president in 1948 as a Dixiecrat, explicitly running on maintaining segregation. He won 4 southern states, proved that white supremacy was still powerful, still popular, still a winning political platform in the South. But the order stood, and it mattered. Not just because the military desegregated, but because it proved that segregation could be challenged federally, that the national government could override state laws, that Jim Crow wasn't permanent, wasn't inevitable, could be dismantled by federal action. Thurgood Marshall understood this. He'd been fighting Jim Crow in court for years, representing the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, taking cases across the South, risking his life every time he set foot in a Southern courtroom because white supremacists knew exactly who he was and what he was trying to do. He'd been threatened, had guns pointed at him, had to be smuggled out of towns in the middle of the night because lynch mobs were forming. But he kept taking cases, kept challenging segregation, kept pushing at the legal framework piece by piece. His strategy was methodical. Chip away at separate but equal. Show that separate was never equal. That segregated schools weren't equal. That the entire doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson was built on lies. Collect evidence. Build cases. Appeal. Appeal again. Gradually work toward the Supreme Court. By 1954, he had 5 cases consolidated into one. Brown versus Board of Education. 5 different challenges to school segregation from 5 different states, all arguing the same thing. Separate schools are inherently unequal. Segregation itself violates the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection. The Supreme Court heard the case. Chief Justice Earl Warren, a former California governor who'd supported Japanese internment during World War II, surprised everyone. He worked to get a unanimous decision. Knew that anything less than unanimous would give the South an excuse to resist. On May 17, 1954, the court ruled separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned. Separate but equal was unconstitutional. School segregation had to end. Jim Crow's legal foundation had been struck. The South didn't comply. Immediately, explicitly, they announced they wouldn't comply. Virginia's Senator Harry Byrd called for massive resistance. Southern states passed laws to avoid integration, closed schools rather than integrate them. Prince Edward County, Virginia closed its public schools for 5 years. 5 years. White children went to private academies. Black children got nothing. The county chose no education over integrated education. Mississippi and South Carolina amended their state constitutions to allow abolishing public schools. Georgia passed a law cutting off funding to any school that integrated. Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas followed. The entire South, with very few exceptions, announced they would resist Brown by any means necessary, and the federal government did almost nothing. President Eisenhower, who'd appointed Earl Warren, refused to endorse the decision publicly. Said the court had ruled that was the law, but wouldn't say whether he agreed with it, wouldn't use federal power to enforce it, wouldn't send troops or marshals or do anything to make southern states comply. So for 3 years after Brown, almost nothing changed. A few border states integrated some schools. Delaware, Maryland, parts of Missouri. But the Deep South didn't budge, and without federal enforcement, they didn't have to, until Little Rock. September 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas. Central High School was ordered to integrate. The school board selected 9 black students. Excellent students, model students. Students who could handle the pressure, the abuse, the hatred. Students who were being asked to integrate a school where thousands of white students and their parents had promised to stop them by any means necessary. Daisy Bates, head of the Arkansas NAACP, prepared them as best she could, told them what to expect, the slurs, the violence, the constant harassment, told them they had to be perfect, had to endure without fighting back, had to represent their entire race because white people would judge all black people by their behavior. September 4th, 1957. The 9 students tried to enter Central High. Elizabeth Eckford arrived separately, missed the group, walked up to the school alone, 15 years old, carrying her books, wearing a handmade dress. She was met by the Arkansas National Guard. Governor Orville Faubus had called them out to prevent integration, to block the black students from entering. Federal court order said they could enter. State governor said they couldn't. The National Guard followed the governor. Elizabeth walked toward the school. A mob of white people surrounded her, adults, screaming at her, calling her a nigger, threatening to lynch her. She tried to walk through. The guard blocked her. She turned, walked back. The mob followed her, screaming, spitting, threatening violence. A photograph captured it. Elizabeth Eckford, 15 years old, walking alone, surrounded by a white mob, their faces twisted with hatred. A white woman behind her, screaming obscenities. Elizabeth's face was composed, dignified, not showing fear even though she must have been terrified. That photograph went around the world. The Soviet Union published it everywhere. This is American democracy. This is what they do to children. President Eisenhower, finally, reluctantly, sent in federal troops. The 101st Airborne Division, 1,200 paratroopers to Little Rock to enforce a federal court order to let 9 black children attend school. They surrounded Central High, escorted the students inside, stayed for the entire school year. Those 9 students endured hell, daily harassment, physical attacks, acid thrown in their faces, kicked downstairs, verbally abused constantly. One of them, Minnie Brown, fought back, was expelled. The other 8 endured, completed the school year, graduated, or continued. But the next year, Governor Faubus closed all of Little Rock's high schools. Closed them rather than integrate them. For an entire year, no public high schools in Little Rock. White students went to private schools, or schools in other districts. Black students got nothing. This was the pattern across the South. Court orders to integrate. Southern states refusing. Federal government occasionally intervening. Southern states finding new ways to resist. Close schools. Create private academies. Use violence to intimidate. Whatever it took to maintain segregation. In Mississippi, nothing integrated. Not schools, not buses, not water fountains, nothing. The state announced it would resist federal authority completely, would maintain segregation regardless of what the Supreme Court said. And for years, they did, because federal enforcement was weak, inconsistent, and when it came slowly. But the cracks were showing. The system the architects had built was under pressure. World War II had changed the psychology. Black veterans weren't willing to accept Jim Crow passively. The Cold War had made American racism an international embarrassment. The Supreme Court had struck down the legal foundation of segregation. Federal troops had enforced integration, even if only in one city, even if only briefly. The cage was showing weaknesses, not breaking yet, still standing, still enforced violently, still maintained by sheriffs and governors and senators who swore they'd never accept integration, but showing weaknesses. And a movement was building. People who decided that patient waiting had failed, that asking nicely had failed, that legal challenges alone wouldn't break Jim Crow, that it would take direct action, mass mobilization, economic pressure, and a willingness to risk death to force change. Isaac Woodard never saw again. Lived until 1992, blind for 46 years, because he asked to use a bathroom while wearing his uniform. But his blinding helped push Truman toward that executive order. His suffering contributed to the pressure that would eventually break Jim Crow. The Little Rock Nine graduated, or moved on, endured hell so that future students wouldn't have to, proved that black students could handle integrated schools, that the white supremacist arguments about educational differences were lies. One of them, Ernest Green, became the first black graduate of Central High, walked across the stage while his white classmates refused to applaud, got his diploma while the audience sat silent, and kept walking. The cracks were showing. The next section is where they break, where the civil rights movement, building on decades of resistance, would finally force Jim Crow's collapse. Not easily, not cheaply. At the cost of thousands of lives, tens of thousands of beatings, hundreds of thousands of arrests. But it would fall. Because what the architects didn't understand, what they couldn't comprehend, was that you can't build a system of oppression strong enough to withstand people who've decided they'd rather die than remain oppressed. Can't make laws comprehensive enough to suppress people who've decided laws are unjust. Can't use violence effectively enough to break people who've decided that dignified death is better than humiliating life. The architects built well. Their cage lasted 70 years, but they built it on lies. And eventually, enough people decided to risk everything to prove those lies false. To force America to choose between its stated ideals and its practiced oppression. To make the hypocrisy so visible, so undeniable, so publicly shameful, that change became inevitable. That's where we're going next. To the movement that broke the cage. To the final battle between the world the architects built and the world their victims demanded. To the end of Jim Crow as law, if not as practice. To 1955 to 1965, when America finally, reluctantly, began to dismantle what those men in that room in Raleigh had built so carefully in 1898. The cage is cracking. Now we watch it break. Fannie Lou Hamer was 44 years old when she tried to register to vote for the first time. This was August 31st, 1962, in Indianola, Mississippi. She'd been a sharecropper her entire life, picked cotton since she was 6 years old, worked land she'd never owned for white people who kept her in debt perpetually. She had a 6th grade education because that's all that was available. But she could read. She could think. And she'd decided she was tired of being treated like property. She went to the courthouse with 17 other black residents from Ruleville. They'd been recruited by civil rights organizers from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Young people mostly, college students who'd come to Mississippi to register voters. They called it Freedom Summer, though it was dangerous enough to be called suicide. Fannie Lou and the others walked into the courthouse. The registrar looked at them like they'd grown second heads. Black people registering to vote? In Mississippi? In Sunflower County, where Senator James Eastland owned a plantation and made sure no black person ever voted? The registrar gave them the literacy test, not the simple one, the one designed to fail. Interpret Section 8 of the Mississippi Constitution. The section was deliberately complex, about corporate regulations. The registrar would decide if your interpretation was acceptable. And for black applicants, it never was. Fannie Lou did her best, answered carefully, knew it wouldn't matter. The registrar failed her, told her she didn't pass, didn't explain why, didn't need to explain why, This was Mississippi. Black people didn't vote. That was the rule. That's how it had always been. She left the courthouse, got on the bus with the others. They were driving back to Ruleville when police stopped them. The driver was charged with driving a bus the wrong color, not speeding, not reckless driving. The bus was too yellow, looked too much like a school bus. This was the kind of made-up charge they used to arrest civil rights workers. Any excuse, any reason. They were held for hours, eventually released. But when Fannie Lou got home that night, the plantation owner was waiting. W.D. Marlowe, the man she'd worked for 18 years, the man whose land she'd picked cotton on since she was a child. "Fannie Lou, did you go down to the courthouse to register?" "Yes, sir, I did." "You'll have to withdraw, or you'll have to leave." She thought about it. Thought about 18 years of work. Thought about the shack she lived in on his property. Thought about having nowhere to go, no job, no home. Then she thought about what it meant to be 44 years old and never having voted, never having had any say in the laws that governed her life, never having been a citizen, just a subject. "Mr. Marlowe, I didn't go down there to register for you. I went down there to register for myself." He told her to leave. That night. Immediately. She'd worked for him for 18 years. He gave her nothing. No severance, no final pay. Just get out. She left. Friends took her in. But 10 days later, white men drove by the house where she was staying and fired 16 bullets into it. Trying to kill her. Trying to kill anyone who'd housed her. Trying to send a message. Register to vote, and we'll kill you. She survived, and she kept registering people, kept organizing, kept speaking. Because she decided that dying free was better than living as a slave. That's what she called it. Not segregation, not discrimination. Slavery. Because when you can't vote, can't own property, can't have any say in your own life, you're not a citizen. You're a slave. By 1964, she was speaking at the Democratic National Convention. Actually speaking. A sharecropper from Mississippi with a 6th grade education, addressing the Democratic Party, demanding that the integrated Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party be seated instead of the all-white segregationist delegation. She told them everything. Told them about trying to register. Told them about being evicted. Told them about being arrested in Winona, Mississippi, and beaten so badly she was permanently injured. The police had forced other black prisoners to beat her with blackjacks while they watched. Beat her until she couldn't scream anymore. Beat her for registering voters, for demanding rights. She said it on national television. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily? President Johnson was terrified of her speech, terrified of this black woman from Mississippi telling the truth about American democracy on national television. So he called a press conference at the exact same time to distract the media, prevented the networks from broadcasting her full testimony live. But they replayed it later, and America heard her. Heard this sharecropper asking questions that had no good answers. Is this America? Is this democracy? Is this the country we claim to be? She was one voice, but she was part of something massive. A movement that had been building since the war, since Brown, since black Americans had decided collectively that they'd waited long enough, asked politely enough, proven themselves sufficiently. That if America wouldn't grant them rights, they'd take them. Force the country to choose between its ideals and its practices. Montgomery, Alabama, December 1955. Rosa Parks, a seamstress and NAACP secretary, refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger. This wasn't spontaneous. She'd been trained in civil disobedience. The NAACP had been looking for a test case. When Parks was arrested, the black community of Montgomery organized, boycotted the buses for 381 days, walked to work, carpooled, refused to ride until the buses integrated. The city fought back, arrested boycott leaders, bombed Martin Luther King Jr.'s house, tried to break the boycott through violence and economic pressure, but the boycott held, and eventually the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. Montgomery's buses integrated, not because white people wanted them to, because black people forced them to. Greensboro, North Carolina, February 1960. 4 black college students sat at a Woolworth's lunch counter, asked for service, were refused, didn't leave, just sat there. The next day, more students came, and more. Within days, hundreds of students were sitting at segregated lunch counters across the South, not violent, not breaking anything, just sitting, asking for service, refusing to leave. They were beaten, had cigarettes put out on their backs, had coffee poured on their heads. White people attacked them while they sat peacefully, and the photographs went everywhere. The images of well-dressed black students being attacked for sitting at lunch counters. The optics were terrible for the South, made segregation look exactly like what it was: violent, irrational, indefensible. The sit-ins spread, thousands of students, tens of thousands of arrests. But it worked. Slowly, store by store, lunch counters began integrating, not because businesses suddenly cared about equality, because segregation was costing them money. Black customers were boycotting, white customers were embarrassed. National chains didn't want their brand associated with violence against peaceful protesters. Freedom Rides, 1961. Integrated groups of activists rode buses through the South, testing whether interstate bus terminals would comply with federal desegregation orders. They knew what would happen. They were going to be attacked. They went anyway. In Anniston, Alabama, a mob firebombed one of the buses. The riders barely escaped before it exploded. In Birmingham, another mob attacked riders with metal pipes and baseball bats. Police Chief Bull Connor had given the KKK 15 minutes to attack before police would intervene. 15 minutes of officially sanctioned violence. The riders were hospitalized, some permanently injured, but more riders came, and more, until Attorney General Robert Kennedy had to send federal marshals to protect them, had to federalize the Alabama National Guard, had to use federal power to enforce the right to integrated travel. The pattern was clear: nonviolent protest, violent white response, national attention, federal intervention. It was forcing the federal government to choose sides, forcing America to see its own ugliness on television every night. Birmingham, 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. led protests against segregation. Bull Connor responded with police dogs and fire hoses, ordered his officers to attack peaceful protesters. Children, some of them. Teenagers marching for their rights. And Connor set dogs on them. Blasted them with fire hoses powerful enough to strip bark off trees. The photographs went around the world. Images of German shepherds attacking black children. Images of fire hoses knocking protesters off their feet. Images that made American racism undeniable, unavoidable, impossible to defend. President Kennedy, watching this on television, finally understood. Not morally, politically. This was destroying America's image internationally. The Soviet Union was using Birmingham in propaganda. Newly independent African nations were questioning American leadership. American racism had become a foreign policy crisis. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy gave a speech calling civil rights a moral issue. Said America had to decide whether it would live up to its ideals, whether all citizens would have equal rights, whether democracy meant something or was just propaganda. He was assassinated 6 months later. But Lyndon Johnson, his successor, understood the political calculation. Johnson was a Southern politician who'd opposed civil rights legislation for years. But he was also ambitious, wanted a legacy, saw that the civil rights movement had created a moment where comprehensive legislation was possible. Freedom Summer, 1964. Hundreds of volunteers, mostly white college students from the North, came to Mississippi to register black voters. They were warned. Mississippi was the most dangerous state in the South, the most resistant, the most violent. Going there to register black voters was suicidal. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner went anyway. They were murdered on June 21st, 1964. The case we mentioned earlier. Sheriff's deputy arrested them, held them, released them to the Klan. They were shot, buried in an earthen dam. Their murders horrified the nation. Not just that they were killed, but that local law enforcement participated, that the state of Mississippi refused to prosecute, that the federal government could barely intervene. It revealed Jim Crow for what it was, a police state where law enforcement murdered civil rights workers and faced no consequences. The pressure was building. The violence was escalating. The federal government had to act. July 2nd, 1964. President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, the most comprehensive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It outlawed discrimination based on race in public accommodations, employment, education, ended legal segregation, made Jim Crow illegal. The South didn't celebrate. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia said it was the worst thing to happen to the South since Reconstruction. Governor George Wallace of Alabama promised to maintain segregation despite federal law. White citizens' councils organized massive resistance, but the law was passed. Segregated lunch counters, hotels, theaters, all legally required to integrate. Schools would have to desegregate, not just on paper, but in practice. Employment discrimination was now illegal. The legal architecture of Jim Crow was being dismantled. But voting was still restricted. The literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all the mechanisms the architects had designed in 1890 were still on the books. The Civil Rights Act didn't touch voting rights. That would require separate legislation. Selma, Alabama, March 1965. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized a march from Selma to Montgomery to demand voting rights. They would march 54 miles to the state capitol. Peaceful, nonviolent, just marching for the right to vote. March 7th, 1965. 600 marchers left Selma. As they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers attacked, beat them with clubs, used tear gas, attacked on horseback, beat John Lewis, a young SNCC leader, so badly his skull was fractured, beat Amelia Boynton unconscious, beat peaceful marchers while television cameras recorded everything. The footage aired that night. America watched state troopers beating peaceful protesters who just wanted to vote. It was called Bloody Sunday. It was the image that broke the dam. President Johnson addressed Congress 8 days later, gave a speech explicitly endorsing the civil rights movement, said, "We shall overcome," adopting the movement's slogan, proposed the Voting Rights Act. August 6, 1965. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. It banned literacy tests, ended the mechanisms the architects had designed to disenfranchise black voters, authorized federal oversight of voting in states with histories of discrimination, sent federal registrars to register black voters. Within months, black voter registration in Mississippi jumped from 6% to 60%. Across the South, hundreds of thousands of black citizens registered to vote, elected black officials, changed state legislatures, altered the political landscape. Jim Crow, as law, was dead 70 years after those men sat in that room in Raleigh and designed it. 70 years of legal segregation, legal disenfranchisement, legal oppression. Over. Not completely, not perfectly, but legally dismantled. But here's what's crucial to understand. The laws changed, but the effects didn't disappear. The wealth gap created by 70 years of economic extraction didn't close. The segregated neighborhoods didn't integrate. The underfunded schools didn't suddenly get equal resources. The attitudes didn't change overnight. And new systems emerged that functioned similarly to Jim Crow. Mass incarceration became the new mechanism of control. The war on drugs started in the 1970s, imprisoned black Americans at rates that exceeded Jim Crow-era incarceration. Private prisons leased prisoners to corporations, exactly like convict leasing. Police departments in black neighborhoods functioned like occupying armies, exactly like Jim Crow-era sheriffs. Residential segregation continued through new mechanisms. Not legal anymore, but functional. Banks still redlined. Real estate agents still steered. White flight created suburban enclaves. Schools resegregated through district boundaries. Charter schools. Private academies. The cage was dismantled legally. But its effects persisted. The wealth that white families accumulated during Jim Crow stayed with them, compounded, was passed down. The poverty that black families were forced into stayed with them, compounded, was passed down. 70 years of legal theft doesn't disappear just because the theft becomes illegal. Fannie Lou Hamer died in 1977. She was 59. She'd been beaten so badly in that Mississippi jail that she never fully recovered. Had kidney damage, had permanent injuries. Died relatively young because of violence inflicted on her for trying to register to vote. But she'd lived to see the Voting Rights Act passed. Lived to see black voters elect black officials in Mississippi. Lived to see the system that had oppressed her entire life start to crack. Not completely, not permanently, but meaningfully. James Meredith, who'd integrated Ole Miss in 1962 with 500 federal troops protecting him, lived to see the University of Mississippi become significantly integrated. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. The school that had rioted against his presence eventually graduated thousands of black students. The Little Rock Nine, who'd faced mobs to integrate Central High, lived to see integrated schools across Arkansas. Lived to see one of them, Ernest Green, become an assistant secretary in the Department of Labor. Lived to see their courage recognized, their suffering acknowledged, their fight vindicated. But let's return to that room in Raleigh, 1898. Those 9 men drafting laws to disenfranchise black voters, building the architecture of American apartheid, designing a system they thought would last forever. They succeeded for 70 years. That's not nothing. 70 years of legal oppression. 3 generations. Millions of lives shaped by the laws they wrote. Billions of dollars of wealth transferred because of the systems they built. But they failed, ultimately. Their system fell. Not easily, not cheaply. It cost thousands of lives, required millions of people risking everything, required federal troops, federal laws, federal intervention, required black Americans refusing to accept oppression even when acceptance seemed safer, required courage that's hard to comprehend. Those architects thought they were building permanence, thought they'd created a legal framework that couldn't be challenged, thought that if you made oppression legal, made it constitutional, made it enforceable by police and courts, it would last forever. They were wrong, because you can't build oppression strong enough to withstand people who've decided freedom is worth dying for. Can't make laws comprehensive enough to suppress people who've decided laws can be unjust. Can't use violence effectively enough to break people who've decided dignity matters more than safety. The architects built well. Their cage lasted longer than most systems of oppression. But they built it on lies. On the lie that black Americans were inferior. On the lie that segregation was natural. On the lie that white supremacy was justified. And eventually, those lies couldn't withstand the evidence of black excellence, black resistance, black humanity demonstrated daily, despite everything. The effects persist. That's what we need to understand. The wealth gap exists because of Jim Crow. The residential segregation exists because of Jim Crow. The school funding disparities exist because of Jim Crow. The mass incarceration exists as Jim Crow's heir. You can't have 70 years of legal extraction and expect the effects to disappear when the extraction becomes illegal. But the cage was broken. The laws that made it legal were struck down. The mechanisms that made it function were dismantled. The system the architects built doesn't exist anymore, at least not in the same form, at least not with legal sanction. And that matters, because it proves that oppression, no matter how carefully designed, how legally protected, how violently enforced, can fall. That people who decide they won't accept injustice can force change. That systems that seem permanent can be dismantled. That the arc of history doesn't bend toward justice automatically, but can be bent by people willing to sacrifice for it. Those men in that room in 1898 thought they were securing white supremacy forever. They were wrong. They built something terrible, something lasting, something that damaged millions of lives. But they didn't build something permanent. Because Fannie Lou Hamer said no. Because Rosa Parks said no. Because Martin Luther King Jr. said no. Because thousands of students sitting at lunch counters said no. Because freedom riders getting beaten said no. Because marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge getting clubbed said no. Because millions of Black Americans over 70 years, in ways large and small, public and private, said no. And eventually, that was enough. Not to undo all the damage, not to erase all the effects, but to break the cage, to dismantle the legal architecture, to end Jim Crow as law. That's the story. That's what happened. That's how American apartheid, carefully designed by educated men in state capitals, enforced by sheriffs with badges, upheld by courts for 70 years, finally fell. It fell because people decided it should fall, and they were willing to die to make it fall. And enough of them died, and enough pressure built, and enough violence was exposed on television, and enough international embarrassment accumulated, that finally, reluctantly, the federal government dismantled what those architects had built. The cage is broken. The effects remain. The fight continues. But the cage that those men built so carefully, that functioned so brutally for so long, no longer exists as law. And that's something. That's victory. Incomplete, imperfect, but real. They built Jim Crow to last forever. It lasted 70 years. That's both too long and not long enough to be permanent. Too long because of the millions who suffered. Not long enough because it proves that nothing, no matter how carefully built, no matter how brutally enforced, can withstand people demanding to be free. That's the legacy. That's the lesson. That's what understanding how Jim Crow was built teaches us. Not just about history, about now. About recognizing when systems of oppression are being built. About resisting before the cage is complete. About understanding that legal oppression can look respectable, can have educated architects, can be defended with constitutional arguments, and still be fundamentally evil. And about remembering that it can fall. That's the hope. In the courage of people who fought it. In the victory, incomplete but real, that they achieved. In the proof that oppression isn't permanent, that resistance works, that freedom is possible. That's how Jim Crow was built, and that's how it fell. The architects designed it well, but they couldn't design it well enough to withstand the humanity of the people they tried to break.